Hello friends. Did you know that nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy the content, I'd truly appreciate it if you hit that subscribe button. It helps a lot. Also, don't forget to leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments. Your interaction not only supports the channel's growth, but also helps these stories reach more people. Thank you all for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. On the evening of October 3rd, 2024, senior FBI agent Garrett Voss received an encrypted message on his secure phone at 9:47 p.m. The message was brief and unsettling. Claiborne missed his third check-in. Chicago field office requesting immediate response. Garrett had worked with Special Agent Ronan Claiborne for 6 years, and the man had never missed a single protocol in his entire career. Ronan was methodical to the point of obsession, the kind of agent who triple-checked his ammunition count and filed reports an hour before deadline. For him to miss one check-in would be concerning. 3 consecutive missed check-ins meant something had gone catastrophically wrong. Garrett sat in his apartment in Lincoln Park, staring at the message while rain hammered against his windows. The Chicago skyline glowed through the darkness, but he wasn't seeing the city's lights. He was thinking about the last conversation he'd had with Ronan, 4 days earlier at the Federal Plaza building. They'd been standing in the parking garage, and Ronan had seemed distracted, constantly glancing over his shoulder. When Garrett asked if everything was all right, Ronan had given him a tight smile and said, "Just tired of being watched all the time. Comes with the job, right?" At the time, Garrett had dismissed it as standard paranoia from deep cover work. Now, those words carried a different weight entirely. By 10:15 p.m., Garrett was in his government-issued Dodge Charger, heading south on the Dan Ryan Expressway toward the coordinates the field office had provided. His partner, Elias Drummond, was already en route from his home in Oak Park and had agreed to meet him at the location. Elias was younger than Garrett by almost a decade, but the man had instincts that defied his age. They'd been partnered for 3 years, and Garrett had learned to trust those instincts implicitly. The highway was relatively empty at this hour, and Garrett made good time as he pushed through the rain. His headlights cut through the downpour, illuminating exit signs and the skeletal frameworks of industrial buildings that lined this stretch of the expressway. The coordinates led him to a section of Chicago's South Side that had seen better decades. The neighborhood was a patchwork of abandoned warehouses, vacant lots filled with overgrown weeds, and the occasional occupied building that looked like it was holding on through sheer stubbornness. This was the kind of area that city officials talked about revitalizing during election years but never quite got around to funding. Streetlights were sporadic. Many of them shot out or simply burned out and never replaced. The rain made everything look like an oil painting, all smeared lights and dark shadows that shifted with every sweep of his windshield wipers. Garrett pulled up to a warehouse on South State Street at 10:48 p.m., parking beside an unmarked bureau vehicle that he recognized as Elias's. His partner was standing under the rusted overhang of a loading dock, collar pulled up against the rain, watching Garrett approach with his characteristic intensity. Elias Drummond was built like a college linebacker who'd kept in shape, with close-cropped hair and a face that could shift from approachable to intimidating in half a second. Right now, his expression was somewhere in between, a look Garrett had come to recognize as Elias working through something that didn't make sense. "This is Claiborne's last known position," Elias said without preamble, gesturing to the warehouse behind him. He was running surveillance on a suspected trafficking operation. Low-level stuff, observation only. He checked in at 6:15 p.m. from inside that building, reported nothing unusual, and said he'd maintain position until his relief arrived at midnight. Never heard from him again. Elias pulled out his phone and showed Garrett the time-stamped log. His relief showed up at 11:55 p.m. Building was empty. No sign of Claiborne. No sign of anyone. His surveillance equipment was still set up, cameras still recording, but he was just gone. Garrett studied the warehouse. It was a 3-story structure, built sometime in the 1960s based on the architecture, with windows that had been boarded up or broken long ago. The main entrance was a rolling metal door that looked like it hadn't been opened in years, secured with a chain and padlock that were covered in rust. Fire escapes clung to the sides of the building like iron skeletons, and several sections of the roof had collapsed inward, exposing the interior to the elements. It was exactly the kind of place that would attract criminal activity, precisely because it looked so thoroughly abandoned that no one would think to look twice at it. "Have we processed the interior yet?" Garrett asked, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it confirmed. Elias shook his head. Tactical team swept it twice. Nothing. No evidence of struggle. No blood. No shell casings. Nothing. His equipment bag was found on the 2nd floor, exactly where he said he'd positioned himself. Everything was there except his sidearm, his phone, and his credentials. Even his car keys were in the bag. That detail made Garrett's jaw tighten. An agent might abandon equipment in an emergency, but Ronan Claiborne wouldn't leave his credentials behind unless he had absolutely no choice, or unless someone had taken them from him. They entered the warehouse through a side door that had been forced open by the tactical team. Garrett clicked on his tactical flashlight, and the beam cut through the darkness to reveal a space that looked frozen in time. Old machinery sat in rusted silence, assembly line equipment that hadn't moved in decades. Wooden pallets were stacked against walls, rotting and covered in graffiti. The floor was concrete, cracked and stained with oil and chemicals that had seeped into the material over years of neglect. Their footsteps echoed in the vast emptiness, and Garrett could hear water dripping somewhere deeper in the building, a steady rhythmic sound that made the silence somehow worse. The 2nd floor was accessible via a metal staircase that groaned under their weight. Ronan's surveillance position was in the northeast corner, where a gap in the boarded windows provided a clear view of the street below and the building across from them. His equipment was indeed still there, just as Elias had described. A digital camera on a tripod aimed through the window gap. A laptop computer, battery dead, with recording software still open on the screen. A duffel bag containing protein bars, water bottles, a first aid kit, and spare ammunition. Everything an agent would need for a long surveillance operation. But no Ronan Claiborne. Garrett crouched beside the equipment, playing his flashlight over every surface. The dust on the floor showed disturbance, footprints that matched standard Bureau-issue boots. Ronan's prints, almost certainly, along with those of the tactical team that had swept the building. But there was something else, too. Garrett moved his light slowly across the floor, following a pattern that didn't quite fit. Another set of prints, smaller and lighter, made by someone wearing what looked like dress shoes rather than boots. These prints followed Ronan's, staying about 6 feet behind his trail. They appeared near the staircase, followed Ronan's path to the surveillance position, then circled around behind where Ronan would have been sitting. "Elias," Garrett said quietly, and his partner immediately came over. Garrett pointed to the secondary prints. Someone else was in here with him. Elias crouched down, studying the marks. Could be from before Claiborne arrived. Could be from whoever was using this building before we started watching it. But Garrett was already shaking his head. "Look at the pattern. These prints are on top of Ronan's in several places. Someone followed him in here, watched him set up, and then..." He trailed off, following the dress shoe prints with his light. They led away from the surveillance position back toward the stairs, but with a detour. The prints led to a section of wall on the western side of the floor. Here, someone had been standing for an extended period. The dust disturbed in a small, concentrated area, as if they'd been shifting their weight while waiting. From this position, they would have had a clear line of sight to Ronan's location. Whoever had been standing here had been watching the agent, not the street below, and the prints showed that this person had remained in position for quite some time before finally moving. Garrett felt a cold sensation spreading through his chest, the kind of instinctive recognition that something was deeply wrong. "Run this," he said, taking photos of the prints with his phone. "Get forensics to analyze these. I want to know what kind of shoe made these marks, what size, everything we can determine." Elias was already on his phone, sending messages to the evidence team. While his partner worked, Garrett continued to examine the space, looking for anything the tactical team might have missed in their initial sweep. What he found was a detail so small that it would have been easy to overlook. On the wall behind where Ronan had positioned his surveillance equipment, someone had scratched a mark into the old paint. It was crude, done with something sharp, probably a key or a knife. The mark was a simple geometric pattern, 3 intersecting lines forming a shape that meant nothing to Garrett. But what made his skin crawl was the fact that the scratches were fresh, the exposed plaster beneath still bright white rather than yellowed with age. This had been made recently, possibly on the same night Ronan disappeared. "Elias, photograph this," Garrett said, stepping aside so his partner could document the mark. While Elias worked, Garrett's phone buzzed with an incoming message. It was from the field office, forwarding him Ronan Claiborne's last check-in recording. Garrett played it, holding the phone to his ear to hear better over the rain that was still hammering on the warehouse roof. Ronan's voice came through clearly. "This is Claiborne, 1815 hours, maintaining surveillance position. No activity to report. Target building remains dark. Will update at next scheduled check-in." His voice sounded normal, calm, professional. There was no indication of distress or concern. But then, just before the recording ended, Garrett heard something else. A sound in the background, barely audible. It was rhythmic, like footsteps, but with a strange quality to them. They were too measured, too precise, like someone deliberately trying to move silently but not quite succeeding. And they were getting closer to wherever Ronan was positioned. The recording ended with a soft click. Ronan disconnecting from the call, and then nothing. Garrett played it again, focusing on those background footsteps. They definitely sounded like dress shoes on concrete, the slight tap and scrape that hard soles made on industrial flooring. "Someone was already in the building when Ronan checked in," Garrett said, and Elias looked up from photographing the wall mark. "Listen to this." He played the recording again, and Elias's expression darkened as he heard the footsteps. "He didn't report anyone else being here. That means either he didn't know they were there or—" Elias didn't finish the sentence, but Garrett knew what he was thinking. Or Ronan had known someone was there and deliberately hadn't reported it, which would mean he either recognized the person or had a reason not to want backup. They continued their examination of the warehouse, moving methodically through each floor. The first floor yielded nothing additional, just more industrial debris and evidence of occasional squatters who'd used the space over the years. The third floor was partially collapsed, the roof damage extensive enough that rain was pouring in through several large gaps. Water had pooled on the floor, and their flashlights reflected off the surface, creating dancing patterns on the walls. It was while examining this floor that Garrett found the second disturbing detail of the night. In a corner that was relatively protected from the rain, someone had arranged a collection of items. It wasn't trash or random debris. It was deliberately organized. A Bureau-issue tactical flashlight, identical to the one Garrett was currently holding. A set of car keys with a distinctive keychain that Garrett recognized immediately. It was a small brass compass that Ronan had carried for years, a gift from his father. A smartphone in a waterproof case, its screen cracked but still faintly glowing with battery power. And lying on top of all this, Positioned with obvious care was Ronan Claiborne's FBI credentials, the leather case open to display his identification and badge. Garrett felt his breath catch. This wasn't the scene of a struggle or an abduction. This was a display, a message. Someone had taken these items from Ronan and arranged them here in this specific location, knowing that they would be found. The positioning was too deliberate, too careful. Whoever had done this wanted the Bureau to see exactly what they'd left behind. Garrett pulled out his phone and started photographing everything, making sure to capture the scene from multiple angles. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing through possibilities, none of them good. "Garrett," Elias called from across the floor. He was standing near one of the gaps in the roof, looking down at something. Garrett joined him and followed his partner's gaze. Below them, in the alley between their warehouse and the building across the street, there was a car. It was Ronan's personal vehicle, a gray Honda Accord that he'd owned for 5 years. The car was parked at an odd angle, as if it had been left in a hurry. All 4 doors were closed, and from this height it appeared undamaged. They made their way back down and out into the rain, approaching Ronan's car carefully. Garrett pulled on latex gloves before trying the driver's door. It was unlocked. Inside, everything appeared normal at first glance. The car was clean, no signs of struggle. Ronan's work bag was in the passenger seat and his bureau radio was clipped to the sun visor. But when Garrett checked the ignition, the keys weren't there. Those were upstairs, along with the rest of Ronan's personal effects. Someone had driven this car here and parked it after taking the items from Ronan. The dashboard display showed the car had last been driven at 8:34 p.m., more than 2 hours after Ronan's final check-in. The odometer indicated the vehicle had traveled approximately 3.7 miles from wherever it had been before arriving at this location. Garrett started the engine using the keyless start sequence, and the car purred to life without issue. The GPS navigation system showed recent destinations. The most recent entry, time-stamped at 8:34 p.m., was for an address in Washington Park, a neighborhood about 4 miles south of their current location. "We need to check this address," Garrett said, showing Elias the GPS screen. His partner nodded, already heading back to his own vehicle. They would go together, 2 cars for safety. As Garrett followed Elias's taillights through the rain-soaked streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He kept checking his mirrors, looking for vehicles that might be following them, but the streets were mostly empty at this hour. Still, the sensation persisted, an itch between his shoulder blades that he'd learned never to ignore. The address from the GPS led them to a residential street in Washington Park. The neighborhood was quiet, houses dark except for the occasional porch light. The specific address was a small brick bungalow, single-story with a chain-link fence around a tiny front yard. The house looked occupied but not currently inhabited. Newspapers were stacked on the porch, and the grass needed mowing. Garrett and Elias parked on the street and approached cautiously, their hands near their sidearms but not drawn. This wasn't a tactical situation yet, but it could become one very quickly. The front door was locked, but a window on the side of the house had been forced open. The frame splintered where someone had pried it up. Garrett made a decision. "We're going in. Document everything." Elias nodded and started recording on his phone while Garrett climbed through the window. Inside, the house smelled stale and unused. Furniture was covered with sheets, and a thin layer of dust coated every surface. This place had been empty for weeks, maybe months. But someone had been here recently. There were fresh footprints in the dust, multiple sets, all appearing to be adult-sized. They moved through the house room by room. Kitchen, empty. Living room, empty. Bathroom, empty. But when they reached the bedroom, they found something that made both agents stop cold. The room had been converted into an operations center. The walls were covered with photographs, hundreds of them, pinned up with such density that barely any paint was visible beneath. And every single photograph was of FBI agents. Garrett recognized faces from the Chicago field office. There was a photo of himself leaving the Federal Plaza building, another of Elias at a coffee shop, dozens of surveillance photos showing agents going about their daily routines, unaware they were being watched. But the center of the wall display was devoted entirely to Ronan Claiborne. Someone had been tracking his every movement for what must have been weeks or months. Photos showed him at work, at home, at the gym, getting coffee, driving his car, meeting with confidential informants. Every aspect of his life had been documented with meticulous attention to detail. And in the center of this collection of Ronan's images, someone had pinned a single white card with a typed message. He knew too much about what we do in the dark. Garrett felt his jaw clench so hard his teeth ached. This wasn't a random surveillance operation. This was targeted, personal, and had been running for a long time without anyone at the Bureau knowing about it. Someone had been watching Ronan, studying him, learning his patterns and his habits. And then that someone had taken him, carefully staging the scene to send a message. Garrett pulled out his phone and started photographing the walls, needing to document every image before forensics arrived and took control of the scene. While he worked, Elias was examining a desk in the corner of the room. On it sat a laptop computer, closed but with its power light faintly glowing. Elias carefully opened it, revealing a login screen with no username displayed. He took photos of the laptop's serial number and model information, then backed away without touching anything else. This would need to be handled by the Bureau's digital forensics team. Whatever was on that computer might provide crucial information about who had been running this surveillance operation and why. As Garrett continued photographing the wall displays, he noticed a pattern in how the images were arranged. The photos of Ronan weren't random. They were organized chronologically, creating a timeline of his movements over the past several months. And there was a second pattern overlaid on the first. Certain photos had been marked with small, colored pins, red pins for some images, blue pins for others, and occasional yellow pins scattered throughout. Garrett couldn't immediately determine what the color coding meant, but it was clearly significant to whoever had created this display. Then he saw something that made his blood run cold. Among the photographs of Ronan, there were several images that appeared to have been taken from inside FBI facilities. One showed Ronan sitting at his desk in the Federal Plaza building. Another captured him in a conference room during what looked like a classified briefing. A third image showed him entering the secure evidence vault in the basement of the building. These weren't photos that could have been taken by an outside surveillance team. These had been taken by someone with access to Bureau facilities, someone who could move through secured areas without raising suspicion. "Elias," Garrett said quietly, and his partner came over. He pointed to the internal facility photos. These were taken by someone inside the Bureau. Elias studied the images, and Garrett watched his partner's expression shift from concern to something darker, something that looked like betrayal mixed with anger. They both understood what this meant. Ronan Claiborne hadn't just been surveilled by an external threat. Someone within their own organization had been tracking him, documenting his every move, and ultimately, it seemed, had been involved in his disappearance. The implications were staggering and terrifying. If someone inside the FBI was compromised, if there was an agent or employee who had turned against their own, then every operation, every investigation, every piece of classified information was potentially at risk. And, more immediately concerning, whoever was responsible for this surveillance operation now knew that Garrett and Elias had found this house. They'd driven Ronan's car here, which meant the GPS record would be in Bureau systems. The people running this operation would know that their surveillance hub had been discovered. Garrett was about to voice this concern when his phone buzzed with an incoming call. The number was blocked, showing only as unknown caller. He almost let it go to voicemail, but something made him answer. "Voss," he said, his voice flat and professional. For a moment there was only silence on the other end, broken by faint static. Then a voice spoke, male, calm, and somehow familiar, though Garrett couldn't place it. "Agent Voss, you're asking the wrong questions about Agent Claiborne. Some investigations are meant to stay closed." The line went dead before Garrett could respond. He immediately tried calling back, but the number had been routed through enough layers of encryption that his phone couldn't establish a connection. He looked at Elias, who had clearly seen Garrett's expression change during the brief call. "What was that?" his partner asked. Garrett replayed what the caller had said, and Elias's face darkened further. "They know we're here. They're watching us right now." He wasn't wrong, and Garrett felt that earlier sensation of being observed intensify into certainty. They needed to secure this location immediately and get forensics here before whoever was running this operation had a chance to sanitize the scene. Garrett called the field office and requested an immediate evidence response team, emphasizing the urgency without fully explaining what they'd found over an unsecured line. While he made the call, Elias continued documenting the room, his phone camera constantly clicking. They would have their own record of everything, independent of whatever official documentation was created. As they worked, Garrett noticed something he'd initially missed. On the desk next to the laptop, there was a small notebook, the kind of cheap, spiral-bound notepad that could be bought at any drugstore. It was open to a page filled with handwritten notes. The handwriting was neat and precise, with annotations that appeared to be surveillance logs. Dates, times, locations, all referring to Ronan Claiborne's movements. But what caught Garrett's attention was an entry near the bottom of the page, dated October 3rd, the same day Ronan disappeared. The entry read, "South State Warehouse, 18 Hunquag. Drummond replacement scheduled 23:55. Window, 5 hours, 55 minutes. Garrett felt something click into place in his mind. Whoever wrote this had known about Ronan's surveillance operation. They'd known when he would be there, how long he would be alone, and when his relief would arrive. This wasn't opportunistic. This was planned with precision, using insider knowledge of Bureau operations. He showed the notebook to Elias, and his partner's expression reflected Garrett's own grim realization. "They had access to our operational schedules," Elias said. "That's not something you can get from external surveillance. That's internal database access." The sound of approaching sirens broke the tense silence. The evidence response team was arriving, along with backup agents to secure the perimeter. Garrett and Elias stepped outside into the rain, which had lessened to a steady drizzle. As the Bureau vehicles pulled up, Garrett found himself scanning the dark windows of neighboring houses, looking for any sign of someone watching. The street appeared quiet, but he couldn't shake the conviction that hostile eyes were tracking their every movement. Whoever had taken Ronan Claiborne was still out there, still watching, still operating from within the shadows of the very organization meant to bring criminals to justice. As forensic technicians began filing into the house, Garrett's phone buzzed again. Another message, this time from an email address he didn't recognize. The message contained no text, only an image file. Against his better judgment, Garrett opened it. The image showed a photograph taken from a high angle, looking down at the street where they were currently standing. The photo was time-stamped just minutes earlier and showed Garrett and Elias standing exactly where they were now, outside the house in Washington Park. Beneath the image was a single line of text. you're closer than Claiborne ever got. That's why you're more dangerous. Garrett showed the message to Elias, and for the first time since they'd been partnered, he saw genuine fear flash across his partner's face. They weren't just investigating Ronan's disappearance anymore. They had stepped into whatever web had caught him, and now they were targets themselves. The person or people behind this operation were confident enough to taunt them, to show that they were being actively monitored. And if they could track 2 federal agents this easily, what else were they capable of? The investigation into Ronan Claiborne's disappearance had just become something far more dangerous than a missing person case. It had become a hunt where the hunters and the hunted were unclear, where the enemy might be sitting at the next desk over in the Federal Plaza building, and where the price of asking the wrong questions might be vanishing into the same darkness that had swallowed their colleague. Garrett looked at Elias, and without exchanging a word, they both understood what came next. They were going to find Ronan Claiborne, no matter who they had to go through to do it. But they would have to be more careful than ever before, because now they knew with certainty that someone within their own ranks was watching, waiting, and willing to make federal agents disappear when they got too close to whatever truth was being hidden. The FBI's Chicago field office occupied floors 12 through 16 of the Federal Plaza building on South Dearborn Street. At 6:47 a.m. on October 4th, Garrett Voss and Elias Drummond entered through the employee entrance, scanning their credentials at 3 separate security checkpoints before reaching the elevator bank. They'd been awake for nearly 24 hours, running on coffee and adrenaline, but neither man suggested going home to rest. The evidence response team had spent all night processing the Washington Park house, and preliminary reports were starting to filter through the system. More importantly, Garrett and Elias needed to have a conversation with their direct supervisor before word spread through the building about what they'd discovered. Special Agent in Charge Declan Price had been running the Chicago field office's Criminal Investigation Division for 6 years. He was a career bureau man, the kind who'd worked his way up through field assignments in places like Detroit, Philadelphia, and Miami before landing the Chicago posting. Price was in his early 50s, with gray hair that he kept military short and a face that showed the accumulated stress of 3 decades in federal law enforcement. His office was on the 14th floor, corner position with windows overlooking the Chicago River and the downtown towers beyond. When Garrett and Elias arrived, Price was already at his desk despite the early hour, reading something on his computer screen with an expression that suggested he already knew this conversation wasn't going to improve his morning. "Close the door," Price said without looking up from his screen. Garrett did. Then he and Elias took seats in the chairs facing Price's desk. The office was standard bureau issue, functional but not luxurious. Framed commendations on the walls, a bookshelf filled with legal references and case files, a photograph of Price shaking hands with a former FBI director. Everything proper and by the book, which made what Garrett was about to report all the more disturbing because it suggested someone in a position similar to Price's had betrayed everything these offices were supposed to represent. Price finally looked up from his screen, and his expression was carefully neutral in the way that meant he was containing significant anger. "I've been reading the preliminary report from the Washington Park location. Someone want to explain to me how we have photographs of federal agents being surveilled from inside our own facilities?" His voice was level, but Garrett could hear the fury underneath it. This wasn't anger directed at them. It was the controlled rage of a man who'd just learned his organization had been compromised from within. Garrett laid out everything they'd found, starting with the warehouse on South State Street and ending with the anonymous phone call and threatening email. He spoke clearly and methodically, presenting facts without speculation, though the implications were obvious enough. Elias supplemented with details about the timeline they'd reconstructed, and the forensic evidence that was being processed. Price listened without interrupting, his fingers steepled in front of his face, his eyes moving between the two agents as they spoke. When they finished, he sat in silence for a long moment, processing what he'd heard. "The laptop from the house is with digital forensics now," Price finally said. "They're being very careful about it because whoever set up that system knew what they were doing. Multiple layers of encryption, remote wipe capabilities that activated the moment we powered it on. The tech team managed to preserve some data, but we lost a significant amount. What they did recover suggests this surveillance operation has been running for at least 8 months, possibly longer." He pulled up something on his screen, turned the monitor so Garrett and Elias could see it. The image showed a spreadsheet with dates, times, and agent names. Dozens of agents from the Chicago field office, all being tracked with the same meticulous attention that had been focused on Ronan Claiborne. Ronan wasn't the only target, Garrett said, though it wasn't really a question. Price shook his head. He appears to have been the primary focus, but no, he wasn't alone. We're still determining the full scope, but preliminary analysis suggests at least 15 agents were under active surveillance. The pattern indicates someone was looking for specific types of behavior or activities. Agents working particular cases, agents with access to certain classified information, agents who'd been asking questions about old investigations. He paused, meeting Garrett's eyes directly. "You and Drummond are both in that database. You've been under surveillance for approximately 3 months. The information hit Garrett like a physical blow. 3 months. Someone had been watching him for 3 months, documenting his movements, learning his patterns, building a profile of his activities. He thought about all the cases he'd worked during that time, all the confidential informants he'd met, all the classified briefings he'd attended. Every piece of operational security he'd maintained had potentially been compromised by someone with insider access. Beside him, Elias had gone very still, and Garrett recognized the expression on his partner's face. It was the same look Elias got right before he did something violent to someone who'd made a serious mistake. "Do we know who?" Elias asked, his voice tight with controlled anger. Price's expression darkened further. "That's where this gets complicated. The surveillance was sophisticated enough to suggest bureau training, possibly even bureau resources. But the digital forensics team found something interesting. The photographs taken inside our facilities weren't captured with phones or hidden cameras. They were pulled directly from our own security system. Someone with administrative access to our surveillance infrastructure was extracting footage and converting it to still images." Garrett felt his stomach drop. The Federal Plaza building's security system was supposed to be one of the most secure in the city. Access to the administrative controls required multiple layers of authorization and was monitored by the FBI's Internal Security Division. For someone to be pulling footage without detection meant they either had legitimate administrative access or had compromised someone who did. Both possibilities were equally disturbing, and both suggested a level of infiltration that went far beyond a single rogue agent. "How many people have that level of access?" Garrett asked. Price pulled up another screen, this one showing a list of names and access credentials. "In this building, 14 individuals. That includes the special agent in charge, myself, 3 assistant special agents in charge, 6 supervisory special agents, and 3 IT security specialists. Everyone on that list has been with the Bureau for at least 15 years, all have top-secret clearance with extensive background checks, and all have spotless service records." He looked at both agents with an expression that conveyed the weight of what he was about to say. "One of those 14 people is either the one running this operation, or they've been compromised by whoever is." The implications spread through Garrett's mind like cracks in ice. If someone at that level was involved, then every aspect of the investigation into Ronan's disappearance was potentially compromised. Every report they filed, every piece of evidence they documented, every strategic decision they made, all of it could be flowing directly to the people they were trying to catch. They couldn't trust the normal channels. They couldn't rely on standard bureau procedures. They were going to have to investigate this case while assuming that hostile eyes were watching their every move from within the organization itself. "What do you need from us?" Garrett asked, because that was the only question that mattered now. They were in this regardless of the danger, regardless of the complications. Ronan Claiborne was missing, and someone within the FBI was responsible. That meant finding him and exposing whoever had betrayed the Bureau had become the same mission. Price seemed to appreciate the directness. "I'm creating a compartmented investigation. Everything related to Claiborne's disappearance goes through me directly. No filing in the main system, no sharing with other divisions unless I specifically authorize it. You two will report only to me, and you'll conduct your investigation as quietly as possible." He slid 2 folders across the desk, physical files rather than digital documents. "These are the complete case files for the investigations Ronan was working on when he disappeared. I've reviewed them personally. Nothing jumps out as obvious motive for what happened to him, but there might be something I'm missing. I need you to go through these and look for connections. Anything that might explain why someone wanted him out of the picture." Garrett took 1 folder, Elias took the other, and they began reviewing the contents while still sitting in Price's office. Ronan had been working 4 active cases at the time of his disappearance. The first was a financial fraud investigation involving a commodities trading firm in the Loop. The second was a background investigation for a federal judgeship appointment. The third was the trafficking surveillance operation that had placed him in the South State Street warehouse. And the fourth was listed simply as Cold Case Review, File 22847A. That last entry had no additional details in the folder, just a reference number and a note that the file was stored in the secure archives in the building's sub-basement. "What's File 22847A?" Elias asked, holding up the page with that notation. Price's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "That's a cold case from '97. 5 FBI agents were investigating a corruption ring within the Chicago Police Department. During the investigation, one of those agents, a woman named Special Agent Larkin Thorne, disappeared under suspicious circumstances. Her body was never found, and the investigation eventually concluded she'd been killed by the corrupt officers she was investigating, though no charges were ever filed due to lack of evidence. The case was officially closed in 2001. Garrett looked at the notation again, feeling pieces of a larger puzzle starting to align in his mind. Why was Ronan reviewing a closed case from that long ago? Price stood up from his desk and walked to the window, looking out over the city. "That's what I've been asking myself since I pulled his assignment logs last night. Ronan requested access to that file 6 weeks ago. He didn't give a specific reason, just noted it was for background research on a current investigation. I approved the request without questioning it because Ronan was thorough to the point of obsession. If he thought an old case might have relevance to something current, I trusted his judgment." "But now you think the old case and his disappearance are connected," Garrett said, and Price turned back to face them. "I think Ronan found something in that file that made someone very nervous. And I think whoever was running the surveillance operation on our agents was specifically watching to see who accessed certain sensitive files. File 22847A might be one of those tripwires." He returned to his desk and wrote something on a piece of paper, sliding it across to Garrett. It was an access code and a file location. "That'll get you into the secure archives. Pull file 2847A and go through it carefully, but do it today and do it quietly. If my theory is correct, someone will notice that the file's been accessed, I want you in and out before they have time to react." Garrett and Elias left Price's office 20 minutes later with clear instructions and a growing sense that they were stepping into something far larger and more dangerous than a simple missing person case. The secure archives were located on sublevel 2 of the Federal Plaza building, accessed through a reinforced door that required both a keycard and a biometric scan. The archives themselves were a maze of climate-controlled rooms filled with file cabinets and document boxes, decades of FBI investigations preserved in organized rows that stretched into the dim distance. They found File 2847A in Section K, Row 17, Cabinet 8. The file box was thick, containing hundreds of pages of reports, photographs, and evidence documentation. Garrett signed it out using the access code Price had provided, and they carried it to one of the small reading rooms that lined the perimeter of the archives. These rooms were soundproof and surveillance-free, designed to allow agents to review sensitive materials without risk of compromise. Under normal circumstances, that security would have been reassuring. Now, knowing that someone had been pulling footage from supposedly secure systems, Garrett wasn't sure anywhere in this building was truly safe. The file told a story that was depressingly familiar to anyone who'd worked law enforcement in Chicago. In 1997, the FBI had opened an investigation into systematic corruption within the Chicago Police Department's Narcotics Division. The corruption wasn't small-scale graft. It was a full criminal enterprise operating under the cover of badge authority. Officers were stealing drugs from evidence, running their own distribution networks, and eliminating anyone who threatened to expose them. The Bureau had assigned 5 agents to the investigation, running it as a joint task force with the U.S. Attorney's Office. Special Agent Larkin Thorne had been the lead investigator, and her reports painted a picture of a woman who was brilliant, determined, and increasingly concerned about the scope of what she was uncovering. Her notes suggested the corruption went beyond street-level officers and included supervisors, possibly even command staff. She'd been building a comprehensive case using wiretaps, financial records, and testimony from confidential informants. Then, on August 14, 1997, she'd gone to meet one of those informants and never came back. The investigation into her disappearance had been extensive, but ultimately fruitless. Her car was found abandoned in a South Side parking lot, keys still in the ignition. Her apartment showed no signs of struggle. Her personal effects were all accounted for except her service weapon and her FBI credentials. The confidential informant she'd been scheduled to meet claimed she never showed up, though investigators suspected he was lying. The corruption case eventually collapsed without Larkin Thorne's testimony and documentation, and the officers under investigation all escaped prosecution. But what caught Garrett's attention was a detail buried in the supplemental reports. In the weeks before her disappearance, Larkin Thorne had reported feeling like she was being followed. She'd noticed the same vehicles appearing near her home and workplace. She'd received anonymous phone calls where the caller said nothing, just breathed and then hung up. She'd documented all of this in her reports, noting that she believed the corrupt officers had identified her as the lead investigator and were trying to intimidate her. Her supervisors had increased her security protocols, but it hadn't been enough to prevent whatever had ultimately happened to her. The parallels to Ronan Claiborne's situation were impossible to ignore. Both were FBI agents investigating corruption. Both had reported feeling surveilled in the weeks before their disappearance. Both had vanished under circumstances that suggested planning and inside knowledge. And now Ronan had been reviewing Larkin Thorne's case file shortly before he disappeared. The connection was clear enough that Garrett couldn't believe it was coincidental. "Look at this," Elias said, pulling a photograph from deep in the file. It showed Special Agent Larkin Thorne with her investigation team, all 5 agents standing in front of the Federal Plaza building. Garrett recognized the photo as the type taken for official records, documenting the composition of major task forces. But what had caught Elias's attention was one of the other agents in the photograph. Standing next to Larkin Thorne, looking younger but definitely recognizable, was Declan Price. The discovery shifted everything. Price had been part of the original investigation into the Chicago PD corruption. He'd worked alongside Larkin Thorne, had presumably been there when she disappeared, had seen the investigation collapse and the case go cold. And now, 27 years later, an agent under his supervision had pulled the file on that investigation and then disappeared under remarkably similar circumstances. It could still be coincidence, but Garrett's instincts were screaming that it wasn't. They continued reading, and the file revealed more details about the original investigation team. Besides Larkin Thorne and Declan Price, the other three agents had been Special Agent Marcus Bellamy, Special Agent Sienna Caldwell, and Special Agent Trevor Ashford. The file contained brief biographies for each. Bellamy had transferred to the New York field office after the case closed and had eventually retired in 2015. Caldwell had left the Bureau in '99 to take a position with a private security firm. Ashford had been killed in the line of duty during a bank robbery response in 2003. Only Price had remained in Chicago, eventually rising through the ranks to his current position. Garrett found a section of the file that contained Declan Price's witness statements about Larkin Thorne's disappearance. His account matched the other agents' reports. He'd last seen Larkin on the morning of August 14th, when they'd met for coffee to discuss the case. She'd seemed focused and professional, showing no signs of stress beyond the normal pressure of a major investigation. When she failed to return from her evening meeting with the confidential informant, Price had been one of the first to sound the alarm. He'd personally led the initial search efforts and had pushed hard for the investigation into her disappearance to be prioritized. Nothing in Price's statements raised any red flags, but Garrett found himself reading between the lines, looking for anything that might suggest hidden knowledge or deception. It was an uncomfortable position to be in, suspecting his own supervisor, but the surveillance operation they discovered was clearly being run by someone with significant authority and access. Price fit that profile, and his connection to the old Larkin Thorne case created a link that couldn't be ignored. At the same time, Price was the one who'd brought them into this compartmented investigation and given them access to the very file that created suspicion about his own involvement. That suggested either innocence or a very sophisticated attempt at misdirection. "We need to talk to the other agents from the original team," Garrett said, and Elias nodded agreement. "Bellamy's in New York, retired but probably still alive. Caldwell left the Bureau, but we should be able to track her down. If Ronan found something in this file that got him disappeared, maybe one of the other agents knows what it was." They spent another hour going through the file, photographing key pages with their phones for reference. The archive's security protocols prohibited removing original documents, but there was no rule against personal documentation for an active investigation. When they finally returned the file to its cabinet and left the archives, it was approaching noon. The Federal Plaza building was busy with the normal rhythm of government work, agents and staff moving through the corridors, focused on their own investigations and responsibilities. To an outside observer, everything would appear routine and professional. But Garrett now saw the building differently, understanding that somewhere in these offices, someone was watching them, tracking their movements, reporting their activities to whoever was running the operation that had swallowed Ronan Claiborne. They took the elevator down to the parking garage, heading for their vehicles to begin the drive to New York to interview Marcus Bellamy. But as they stepped out of the elevator, Garrett noticed something that made him slow his pace. His car, a Bureau-issued Dodge Charger that had been parked in his assigned spot when he'd arrived that morning, was now positioned differently. Not dramatically, just shifted a few inches forward from where it had been. It was the kind of detail most people wouldn't notice, but Garrett had a habit of memorizing spatial relationships, and he was certain the car had been moved. Elias saw Garrett's expression and immediately became alert. "What is it?" Garrett pointed to the car without approaching it. "Someone's been in my vehicle." They conducted a visual inspection from a distance first, looking for any obvious signs of tampering or surveillance devices. Nothing appeared obviously wrong, but that didn't mean much. Modern surveillance equipment could be incredibly small and well hidden. Garrett pulled out his phone and called the field office's technical services division, requesting a sweep team for his vehicle. While they waited for the tech team to arrive, Garrett's phone rang. The number was blocked again, the same unknown caller designation as the threatening call from the previous night. He answered it, putting the call on speaker so Elias could hear. "Agent Voss." The same male voice as before, calm and measured, spoke with what almost sounded like amusement. "You're persistent, that's admirable, but you're also predictable. File 2847A was accessed at 9:17 this morning. We knew you'd go there eventually. The question is, do you understand what you're really looking at?" Garrett kept his voice level, not giving the caller the satisfaction of knowing how much this was getting under his skin. "Why don't you explain it to me, since you seem to know so much?" There was a pause, and he could hear the sound of typing in the background. Someone working on a keyboard while conducting this conversation. Special Agent Larkin Thorne got too close to something that powerful people wanted kept hidden. Not just corrupt police officers, Agent Voss. That was always a cover for something larger. She discovered a network that spans decades, that includes law enforcement, government officials, and private sector entities. A network that does not tolerate exposure. And Ronan Claiborne discovered the same thing, Garrett said, no longer asking, but stating the obvious conclusion. The caller made a sound that might have been agreement. Agent Claiborne was brilliant and thorough. He saw patterns in that old case file that no one else had noticed. He started asking questions, pulling other old files, making connections that should have remained buried. So yes, he discovered the same thing, and now he's learning the same lesson Larkin Thorne learned. Some truths are too dangerous to pursue. The call ended abruptly, leaving Garrett and Elias standing in the parking garage with more questions than answers. The technical services team arrived 15 minutes later and spent an hour examining Garrett's vehicle. They found 3 separate tracking devices, all high-grade equipment that wouldn't have shown up on standard electronic sweeps. One was attached to the undercarriage, one was hidden in the wheel well, and one had been installed inside the dashboard, requiring disassembly of the console to access it. Whoever had placed these devices had skills and resources that matched or exceeded Bureau capabilities. More disturbing was what the tech team found when they analyzed the devices. They weren't just trackers, they were also equipped with listening capability. Everything Garrett had said inside his car for the past 3 months had potentially been monitored and recorded. Every conversation with Elias, every phone call he'd made while driving, every moment when he'd thought he was alone and secure. All of it had been available to whoever was running this surveillance operation. The violation felt physical, a breach of privacy so complete that it made Garrett's skin crawl. With his vehicle compromised, Garrett arranged for a replacement from the motor pool while his original car was taken to the forensics bay for further examination. He and Elias would drive to New York in the new vehicle, a Chevrolet Suburban that had just been delivered to the field office and hadn't yet been assigned to any agent. If someone was tracking their movements, they'd at least make it difficult by changing their transportation. They loaded their overnight bags and case files into the Suburban and pulled out of the parking garage just after 2 p.m. The drive to New York would take approximately 12 hours under normal conditions. They planned to drive straight through, taking turns at the wheel, using the time to discuss the case and plan their approach to interviewing Marcus Bellamy. But as they merged onto Interstate 80 heading east, Garrett noticed a dark blue sedan that seemed to be maintaining a consistent distance behind them. It stayed back far enough to avoid being obvious, but close enough to keep them in sight. Garrett mentioned it to Elias, who checked the mirrors and confirmed the surveillance. They tested it by varying their speed, taking an unexpected exit and then immediately getting back on the highway and switching lanes in patterns that would be difficult to follow without obvious intent. The sedan matched every move, confirming that they were being actively tailed. Whoever was running this operation wasn't even trying to hide their surveillance anymore. They wanted Garrett and Elias to know they were being watched, likely hoping the psychological pressure would make them abandon the investigation or make mistakes that could be exploited. "Should we try to lose them?" Elias asked, his hand resting near his service weapon in the instinctive way law enforcement officers did when they felt threatened. Garrett considered it but shook his head. "No, let them follow. If they're watching us, that means they're not focusing resources on covering their tracks. The more attention they pay to us, the more opportunities they create for making mistakes." It was thin logic, but it was better than nothing. They needed any advantage they could get, even if it was just the hope that their adversaries might become overconfident. As the miles passed and the Chicago skyline disappeared in the rearview mirror, Garrett found himself thinking about Ronan Claiborne and Larkin Thorne. Two agents, separated by 27 years, who'd apparently discovered the same dark secret and paid the same price. How many others had there been? How many FBI agents had stumbled onto this network and been quietly eliminated, their disappearances explained away as workplace accidents or unsolved mysteries? The idea that the Bureau, an organization he'd devoted his career to, could be so thoroughly compromised was almost too disturbing to fully process. His phone buzzed with an incoming email. This one from a Bureau address he recognized as belonging to the Digital Forensics Unit. The email contained preliminary results from the laptop recovered at the Washington Park house. The tech team had managed to crack some of the encryption and had found file directories that suggested the surveillance operation extended far beyond Chicago. There were references to FBI field offices in New York, Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., and Miami. Names of agents from multiple cities, all apparently being tracked with the same systematic attention. Whatever this network was, it operated nationally, possibly internationally. This wasn't a local corruption issue. This was something vast and coordinated, something that had been running for decades without detection. And Garrett and Elias were now trying to expose it with almost no resources, and no way to know who they could trust. The absurdity of their position would have been laughable if it weren't so deadly serious. Two federal agents against a network that had been successfully eliminating threats for at least 27 years. The odds were not in their favor. As darkness fell and they crossed into Pennsylvania, the blue sedan was still behind them, maintaining its careful distance. Elias had taken over driving while Garrett reviewed case files by the light of his phone, looking for any detail they might have missed. The anonymous caller's words kept echoing in his mind. She discovered a network that spans decades, that includes law enforcement, government officials, and private sector entities. If that was true, if this network really was that large and well-connected, then finding Ronan Claiborne alive seemed increasingly unlikely. But they had to try, had to follow this through to whatever end awaited them, because the alternative was accepting that federal agents could simply vanish when they asked the wrong questions. And if they accepted that, then everything they'd sworn to uphold meant nothing at all. The highway stretched ahead of them into the darkness, carrying them toward New York and toward whatever answers Marcus Bellamy might provide. Behind them, the sedan's headlights remained constant, a reminder that every move they made was being observed and reported. Garrett settled back in his seat, closing his eyes but not sleeping, his mind running through scenarios and possibilities, trying to find a path forward that didn't end with them disappearing just like Ronan and Larkin. The answer wasn't coming to him, but he knew with absolute certainty that they'd crossed a threshold. There was no turning back now, no way to unknow what they'd discovered. They would either expose this network or become its next victims. Those were the only two possibilities remaining. Marcus Bellamy lived in a modest townhouse in the Astoria neighborhood of Queens, a 20-minute drive from the chaos of Manhattan. Garrett and Elias arrived at 3:47 a.m. on October 5th, exhausted from the drive, but too wired on caffeine and adrenaline to feel the full weight of their sleeplessness. The blue sedan that had followed them from Chicago was nowhere in sight, having disappeared somewhere in New Jersey. Either their surveillance had shifted to a different vehicle, or whoever was tracking them already knew where they were going and didn't need to maintain visual contact. Neither possibility was reassuring. The townhouse was part of a row of identical brick buildings, each with a small front yard and a narrow driveway. Lights were on in several windows despite the early hour, suggesting Marcus Bellamy was either an early riser or had never gone to bed. They'd called ahead from a gas station payphone in Pennsylvania, an old-school precaution that felt almost paranoid until Garrett remembered the tracking devices that had been pulled from his vehicle. If their phones were compromised, if their communications were being monitored, then payphones and cash transactions were the only way to maintain any operational security. Bellamy had agreed to meet with them, though his voice on the phone had carried a note of weary resignation, as if he'd been expecting this call for years and had finally run out of ways to avoid it. Garrett knocked on the front door. 3 measured raps that wouldn't wake the neighbors but would be clearly audible inside. The door opened almost immediately, revealing a man in his late 60s with iron-gray hair and the kind of lean build that suggested a lifetime of disciplined fitness routines. Marcus Bellamy wore reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and a Syracuse University sweatshirt that had seen better decades. His eyes moved over Garrett and Elias with the practiced assessment of someone who'd spent 40 years evaluating threats and determining trustworthiness in the span of seconds. "You look like hell," Bellamy said without preamble, stepping aside to let them enter. "When was the last time either of you slept?" Garrett exchanged a glance with Elias, and Bellamy made a dismissive gesture. "Never mind. Stupid question. Come in before someone sees you standing on my doorstep at this hour." They followed him into a living room that was precisely what Garrett expected from a retired FBI agent. Comfortable, but not luxurious, with the bookshelves filled with legal thrillers and true crime accounts, and photographs on the walls showing Bellamy at various stages of his career, always in the company of other agents, always with that same expression of controlled alertness. Bellamy gestured them toward a couch and took a seat in an armchair that faced the front window, positioning himself where he could watch the street. The habit was so ingrained it was probably unconscious, always maintaining situational awareness, always keeping an eye on potential approaches. "Your call mentioned Ronan Claiborne," Bellamy said, and his tone made it clear he'd already guessed why they were here. "I assume he's missing, and I assume it has something to do with Larkin Thorne's case. Am I close?" The directness was almost startling, and Garrett found himself reassessing his initial impression of the retired agent. "How did you know?" Elias asked, and Bellamy's expression shifted into something that might have been a sad smile. "Because it's happened before. Not to the same degree, not with someone actually disappearing, but over the years there have been agents who've pulled that file, started asking questions, and then suddenly found themselves reassigned or pushed into early retirement, or facing internal investigations that conveniently derailed their careers. I've been waiting for someone to make the full connection, for an agent to push hard enough that they couldn't just be quietly sidelined. Sounds like Claiborne was that agent." Garrett pulled out his phone and showed Bellamy the photographs he'd taken of the surveillance wall in the Washington Park house, hundreds of images showing FBI agents being tracked and monitored. Bellamy studied the photos with the careful attention of someone who understood exactly what he was looking at, and with each image, his expression grew darker. When he finally looked up, I saw his anger in his eyes, but also something that looked like vindication. So they've finally stopped being subtle about it. That's either desperation or confidence, and I'm not sure which is worse. Tell us about Larkin Thorne, Garrett said, deciding that direct questions were the approach Bellamy would respect. Tell us what really happened in '97. Bellamy was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a story he'd been carrying for nearly 3 decades. The official version is mostly accurate. We were investigating corruption in the Chicago PD's narcotics division. Multiple officers were stealing drugs, running their own distribution networks, eliminating witnesses and informants who might expose them. It was systematic and brutal, and Larkin was the best investigator I've ever worked with. She had this ability to see patterns that everyone else missed, to connect disparate pieces of information into coherent narratives. He stood and walked to a bookshelf, pulling down a photo album that looked decades old. Inside were pictures from the investigation, the 5-agent team that Garrett had seen in the case file. Bellamy tapped a photo of Larkin Thorne, a woman in her early 30s with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and eyes that seemed to look through the camera rather than at it. 6 weeks into the investigation, Larkin came to me privately. She said she'd found something that didn't fit the pattern. Financial records that showed money flowing not just to the corrupt officers but through them, moving up the chain to people who weren't cops. She started digging deeper, following the money trails, and what she found terrified her. Bellamy returned to his chair, the photo album open on his lap. She discovered that the narcotics corruption wasn't the crime. It was a symptom. The real operation was a network that used law enforcement as a tool, recruiting corrupt officers to facilitate criminal enterprises while simultaneously using legitimate law enforcement to eliminate competition and maintain control. It was elegant in a horrifying way. They weren't fighting the system, they were the system. Police, prosecutors, judges, FBI agents, all working in coordination to protect certain criminal operations while aggressively prosecuting others. The implications of what Bellamy was describing were staggering. Garrett had investigated corruption before, had seen how individuals within law enforcement could be compromised by money or blackmail. But this was something entirely different. A conscious infiltration of multiple agencies, a coordinated effort to turn the institutions meant to enforce the law into tools for protecting specific criminal interests. "How high did it go?" he asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. "We never found out," Bellamy said, and there was frustration in his voice even after all these years. Larkin was being methodical, building an airtight case before bringing it to anyone in authority because she wasn't sure who could be trusted. She'd identified at least 7 FBI agents in various field offices who appeared to be part of the network, plus unknown numbers in local law enforcement and the court system. She was planning to take everything directly to the FBI director's office, bypassing the normal chain of command entirely. Then she disappeared, and all her documentation disappeared with her. Elias leaned forward, his expression intense. "What happened to the evidence? All the financial records? The surveillance? Everything she'd compiled?" Bellamy's face hardened. "That's where it gets interesting. The day after Larkin vanished, there was a fire in the secure evidence room where we'd been storing materials related to the investigation. Not a huge fire, very contained, but it destroyed exactly the section where our case files were kept. The official investigation ruled it an electrical malfunction. but the timing was impossible to ignore. Within 24 hours of Larkin's disappearance, every piece of physical evidence supporting her expanded investigation was gone. Garrett thought about the Washington Park house, about the surveillance operation that had been tracking FBI agents for months or years. Someone inside the Bureau was monitoring the investigation. They knew what Larkin had found, and they eliminated both her and the evidence before she could expose them. Bellamy nodded slowly. That was my conclusion then, and nothing I've seen since has changed my mind. The corruption investigation officially continued for another year, but it was just theater at that point. We prosecuted a handful of street-level officers, enough to make it look like we'd accomplished something, but the real network was never touched. "What about Declan Price?" Garrett asked, watching Bellamy's face carefully for any reaction to the name. "He was part of your team. What was his role in all this?" Bellamy's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes, a moment of calculation before he answered. Declan was a solid agent, young, ambitious, believed in the Bureau's mission. He was devastated when Larkin disappeared, spent months pushing for the investigation to continue. Eventually, he had to accept that the case was dead and move on. He stayed in Chicago while the rest of us scattered to other offices. I always wondered if that was smart or stubborn. The answer was careful, diplomatic, the kind of response that said a lot by saying very little. Garrett pressed further. "Did you ever suspect him of being compromised?" Bellamy was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. "I've suspected everyone at some point over the years. That's what this kind of thing does to you. It makes you question every colleague, every friendship, every interaction. Did I ever have concrete evidence that Declan Price was part of the network? No. Did I ever have concrete evidence that he wasn't? Also, no. That's the problem with infiltration at this level. The absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence." A sound from outside made all three men tense, heads turning toward the window. It was just a car passing by, headlights briefly illuminating the interior of the townhouse before moving on. But the moment of alertness didn't fully pass. They were all aware that this conversation was potentially being monitored, that coming here might have exposed Bellamy to the same threats that had claimed Larkin Thorne and Ronan Claiborne. The retired agent seemed to sense their concern and gave a slight shake of his head. "I'm not afraid anymore," Bellamy said quietly. "I've been waiting 27 years for someone to pick up where Larkin left off. If talking to you puts me in danger, then at least it means someone's still trying to expose this thing. That's more than I've been able to do since I retired." He closed the photo album and set it aside. "What else do you need to know?" Garrett had dozens of questions, but one in particular had been nagging at him since reviewing the case file. The other agents on the original team, Sienna Caldwell and Trevor Ashford, what happened to them? Bellamy's expression darkened. Trevor was killed in 2003 during a bank robbery response in Cleveland. The official report said he was shot by one of the robbers. I've always wondered if that was true, or if it was made to look like a line-of-duty death when really he'd figured something out and had to be eliminated. As for Sienna, she left the Bureau in '99 and dropped off the grid. I tried to find her a few years ago, ran every search I could think of. But she's either very good at staying hidden, or she's dead. The pattern was clear and chilling. Of the 5 agents who'd investigated the corruption network in 1997, one had disappeared. One had died in suspicious circumstances. One had vanished after leaving the Bureau, and only 2 remained. Bellamy himself, who'd spent decades keeping his head down in retirement, and Declan Price, who'd risen through the ranks in the same city where the investigation had originated. It was impossible not to see a story in those outcomes, even if the exact details remained murky. "There's something else you need to know," Bellamy said, standing and walking to a closet near the front door. He reached up to the top shelf and pulled down a small fireproof safe, the kind people kept important documents in. He opened it with a key he wore on a chain around his neck and removed a manila envelope that looked old and well handled. After Larkin disappeared, I couldn't let it go. I knew the Bureau had closed down the investigation, knew that pushing forward would probably end my career, or worse, but I kept digging, quietly, carefully, using vacation days and personal time to follow leads that the official investigation had abandoned. He handed the envelope to Garrett. What I found was fragmentary, pieces of a larger puzzle that I never managed to complete. Financial records showing shell companies and offshore accounts, surveillance photos of known criminals meeting with people who appeared to be law enforcement, copies of arrest reports that showed suspicious patterns in how certain cases were handled. Nothing that would hold up in court, but enough to convince me that Larkin had been right about the scope of this network. I've kept these materials hidden for decades, waiting for the right person to give them to. I think you might be that person. Garrett opened the envelope carefully, aware that he was handling evidence that might be the only remaining proof of what Larkin Thorne had discovered. The contents were exactly as Bellamy described. Fragmentary but suggestive pieces that hinted at a larger structure without fully revealing it. There were bank statements showing transfers between accounts registered to what appeared to be legitimate businesses but with patterns that suggested money laundering. There were photographs taken with a telephoto lens, showing meetings between individuals in locations clearly chosen for privacy. There were handwritten notes in Larkin Thorne's distinctive script, observations and theories she'd been developing before her disappearance. One document in particular caught Garrett's attention. It was a photocopy of an internal FBI memo dated July '97, marked confidential and addressed to the Assistant Director of the Criminal Investigation Division. The memo outlined concerns about the Chicago corruption investigation, specifically noting that it had expanded beyond its original scope and was now touching on matters that required careful handling at the highest levels. The memo recommended that oversight of the investigation be transferred to a specialized unit with appropriate security clearances. It was signed by someone whose name had been redacted, but the title underneath the signature read, Supervisory Special Agent, Internal Security Division. The Internal Security Division, Garrett said, looking at Bellamy. That's the office that's supposed to investigate corruption within the Bureau itself. If they were involved in shutting down Larkin's investigation, he didn't need to finish the thought. If the very office charged with maintaining integrity within the FBI was part of the network, then the corruption went to the absolute core of the organization. There would be no safe place to take evidence, no authority that could be trusted to act on it. Bellamy nodded grimly. That's what convinced me to back off. When I saw that memo, I realized we weren't fighting corrupt individuals. We were fighting an institutional structure that had been specifically designed to protect itself. The Internal Security Division doesn't just investigate corruption, it controls the narrative about corruption. They decide which cases get pursued and which ones get buried. If they're compromised, then there's no internal mechanism for fixing the problem. The three men sat in silence for a moment, the weight of what they were discussing settling over them like a physical presence. Garrett thought about Ronan Claiborne, about whether his former colleague was still alive somewhere or whether he'd already met the same fate as Larkin Thorne. The odds weren't good, but as long as they didn't have a body, there was still a chance. And even if Ronan was gone, even if this investigation ended with another name added to the list of agents who'd asked too many questions, at least they would have tried. At least they would have pushed back against the darkness instead of accepting it. "What do you suggest we do?" Elias asked, and Garrett appreciated his partner's pragmatism. They had information now, context that helped explain why Ronan had disappeared and who might be responsible. But knowing and proving were different things, and without a clear path forward, all this knowledge just made them more dangerous to themselves and others. Bellamy stood and walked to the window, looking out at the slowly lightening sky as dawn approached. "You can't trust the normal channels," Bellamy said. "That should be obvious by now. Anything you report through official systems will be intercepted and neutralized. You probably can't even trust your immediate supervisor, though I'll admit Declan Price has always been an enigma to me. What you need is leverage. Something so damaging that the network can't simply make you disappear without triggering exactly the kind of exposure they're trying to prevent." He turned back to face them. "You need to find Larkin Thorne's body." The suggestion was unexpected, and Garrett felt his mind racing to understand the logic. "I don't follow. How does finding a body from 1997 give us leverage?" Bellamy's expression was grim but determined. "Because if you can prove that Larkin was murdered, and if you can tie that murder to specific individuals within law enforcement, then you have evidence of a crime that can't be dismissed as paranoia or conspiracy theory. More importantly, you have something you can threaten to expose publicly if anything happens to you. The network's power depends on operating in the shadows. Force them into the light, and they lose their most important advantage." It made sense in a terrible way. The network had successfully eliminated or neutralized every agent who'd gotten close to exposing them because they'd been able to do it quietly, making people disappear or die in ways that didn't draw attention. But if Garrett and Elias could find proof of Larkin Thorne's murder, if they could document the chain of evidence connecting her death to specific FBI agents or officials, then they'd have something that could be weaponized, not submitted through official channels where it would be buried, but held as insurance, with arrangements to release it publicly if they met untimely ends. "Do you have any idea where her body might be?" Garrett asked. And Bellamy walked back to the photo album, flipping through pages until he found what he was looking for. It was a map of the Chicago area, hand-drawn on a piece of graph paper, with several locations marked with X's. These are places Larkin mentioned in her notes, locations where she'd observed suspicious activity or meetings. After she disappeared, I checked all of them, but I was looking for evidence of criminal operations, not a burial site. If I were going to hide a body somewhere in Chicago, somewhere it wouldn't be accidentally discovered, I'd choose one of these locations. He pointed to an X marked on what appeared to be the south side, near the industrial areas along the Chicago River. This spot in particular, it's an abandoned industrial complex, used to be a steel processing facility before the industry collapsed in the 80s. Multiple buildings, underground access tunnels, contaminated ground that makes development impossible. The kind of place where you could hide something permanently and no one would ever look twice. Garrett photographed the map with his phone, making sure to capture all the details. As dawn light began filling the room, Bellamy made coffee, and they continued talking, going through every piece of information the retired agent had accumulated over the decades. Garrett and Elias asked questions, clarifying details, building a mental model of the network's structure and operations. It was like assembling a puzzle from scattered pieces, never quite seeing the complete picture but getting enough of an outline to understand the general shape. By the time they finished, it was nearly 8 a.m., and they'd been awake for over 24 hours straight. Bellamy walked them to the door, his expression grave. "You understand what you're walking into. These people have been protecting themselves for at least 30 years, probably longer. They've killed federal agents, destroyed evidence, corrupted multiple institutions, and they've done it all without ever being seriously threatened. What you're attempting is incredibly dangerous, and the odds of success are not in your favor." He paused, then extended his hand to Garrett. But someone has to try. Someone has to stand up and say this isn't acceptable. If you're willing to be those people, then you have my respect and whatever help I can provide." Garrett shook his hand, feeling the firm grip of a man who'd spent his career upholding principles that had ultimately been betrayed by the institution he'd served. "Thank you for talking to us, and for keeping this information safe all these years." Bellamy gave a slight nod. "Find Larkin, find Ronan, expose these bastards, and if you can't do that, at least make sure they pay a price for what they've done. That's all I ask." They left the townhouse and walked to their Suburban, both scanning the street for surveillance as they climbed in. The drive back to Chicago would take another 12 hours, but this time they had a destination and a plan. They would search the industrial complex Bellamy had marked on his map. They would look for evidence of Larkin Thorne's remains, anything that could prove she'd been murdered rather than simply disappearing. And if they found that proof, they would use it as leverage, insurance against the network's ability to make them vanish like they had so many others. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble based on fragmentary information from a decades-old cold case. But it was the only plan they had. As they pulled away from the curb, Garrett noticed a car parked 3 spaces down the street. It was a dark blue sedan, possibly the same one that had followed them from Chicago, though at this distance and in the morning light it was hard to be certain. The car didn't start its engine or pull out to follow them. It just sat there, and Garrett could see a figure in the driver's seat, watching them leave. The message was clear. They were still under surveillance, their movements still being tracked and reported. The network knew they'd spoken to Marcus Bellamy, knew what information had been shared, and would be adjusting their responses accordingly. "They're not even hiding anymore," Elias said, having noticed the same car. "That's meant to intimidate us, make us second guess whether this is worth it." Garrett kept his eyes on the road ahead, merging onto the highway that would carry them west toward Chicago. "Or it's meant to make us paranoid, make us see threats everywhere, until we're too scared to function effectively. Either way, we can't let it work. We stay focused on finding evidence, stay focused on the mission." The highway stretched ahead of them, relatively empty in the early morning. They had a long drive ahead. Time to plan their approach to searching the industrial complex. Time to think through contingencies and prepare for the likelihood that this investigation would get more dangerous before it got better. Garrett thought about Ronan Claiborne, wondering if his colleague was still alive somewhere, held captive by people who wanted to know what he'd discovered and who he'd shared it with. Or whether Ronan was already dead, his body hidden in some location where it would never be found, another casualty in a war that most people didn't even know was being fought. His phone buzzed with an incoming message, and Garrett felt his stomach tighten when he saw it was from the same blocked number that had called him twice before. The message contained no text, only an image file. He opened it, and what he saw made him have to consciously keep his hands steady on the steering wheel. The image showed Marcus Bellamy's townhouse, photographed from across the street. In the photograph, clearly visible through the front window, were 3 figures: Bellamy and 2 visitors who were obviously Garrett and Elias based on their postures and builds. The photo was time-stamped from earlier that morning, taken while they were inside having their conversation. Below the image was a text message. "Former Special Agent Marcus Bellamy has been very helpful to you. It would be unfortunate if his assistance led to consequences he hasn't experienced in 27 years of carefully staying silent. Perhaps you should consider how your investigation affects not just yourselves, but everyone you involve. Some retired agents have earned their peace." The threat was explicit and chilling. They were being warned that continuing this investigation would result in harm to Bellamy, and probably to anyone else they spoke to or sought help from. The network was showing its reach. demonstrating that they could strike at anyone, any time, and that Garrett and Elias's actions would have consequences beyond just themselves. It was psychological warfare, an attempt to isolate them by making them afraid to involve others, and Garrett had to admit it was effective. The last thing he wanted was for Marcus Bellamy to pay a price for doing the right thing after decades of forced silence. But the threat also revealed something important. The network was worried. If they weren't concerned about what Garrett and Elias might discover, they wouldn't be resorting to intimidation. They would simply eliminate the threat the way they apparently had with Larkin Thorne and Ronan Claiborne. The fact that they were trying to scare them off instead of killing them outright suggested either reluctance to create too many disappearing agents in a short time frame, or uncertainty about how much information Garrett and Elias had already secured and shared with others. Either way, it was a weakness that could potentially be exploited. "We need to call Bellamy," Elias said, having read the message over Garrett's shoulder. "Warn him that he might be in danger." Garrett was already dialing from his phone, using the direct number Bellamy had given them. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail, and Garrett left a message that was deliberately vague, but would convey the urgency to anyone who understood the context. He tried twice more over the next 10 minutes, but there was no answer. The silence was ominous, suggesting that either Bellamy had wisely decided to go to ground, or the network had already moved against him. They drove through the morning in tense silence, each lost in their own thoughts. The landscape of Pennsylvania rolled past, industrial towns and farming communities, places where life continued in its normal patterns while they pursued shadows and secrets that most people couldn't imagine. Garrett found himself thinking about the fundamental question that had been nagging at him since this investigation began. What could be worth corrupting the FBI, worth killing federal agents, worth maintaining a criminal network for decades at enormous risk and expense? It had to be something bigger than drugs or money laundering. Those were serious crimes, but they didn't require this level of institutional infiltration to protect. This kind of operation, this level of corruption, suggested something that would create catastrophic consequences if exposed. Not just criminal prosecutions, but political earthquakes, institutional collapse, public loss of faith in fundamental government structures. Whatever Larkin Thorne had discovered, whatever Ronan Claiborne had figured out, it was significant enough that powerful people had concluded murder and conspiracy were preferable to exposure. As they crossed into Ohio, Garrett's phone rang with a call from a number he recognized as belonging to Declan Price. He answered cautiously, aware that this call was almost certainly being monitored by multiple parties. "Voss?" Price's voice was tense, carrying an edge that Garrett had rarely heard from his normally composed supervisor. "Where are you right now? And don't bother lying because I can pull your GPS if I need to." There was no point in deception. "On I-80, heading west through Ohio. We went to New York to interview Marcus Bellamy." There was a pause, and Garrett could hear Price breathing, that particular rhythm that suggested someone was trying to control their anger. "You went to interview a witness in a classified investigation without clearing it with me first, without backup, and without filing a movement report. Do you have any idea how many protocols you just violated?" The anger was real, but Garrett thought he detected something else underneath it, a concern that went beyond procedural violations. "We got information that was crucial to understanding Claiborne's disappearance. Bellamy was part of the original investigation in '97, and he had materials that—" "Stop," Price cut him off. "Do not discuss operational details over an unsecured line. Whatever you learned, whatever materials you received, we'll debrief when you get back to Chicago. Until then, maintain radio silence except for emergency communications. And Voss, when I say emergency, I mean life-threatening situations only. Is that clear? The instruction was pointed, and Garrett understood the subtext. Price was warning them that their communications were compromised, that anything they said could and would be used against them by whoever was running the surveillance operation. Understood. Good. Drive safe and get back here as quickly as you can. We have developments on this end that you need to be briefed on. Price ended the call before Garrett could ask what those developments were, leaving them with more questions and a growing sense that events were accelerating beyond their control. Whatever was happening in Chicago, whatever Price needed to tell them, it was significant enough that he was willing to wait hours for an in-person briefing rather than risk discussing it over the phone. That suggested either a major breakthrough or a major disaster, and Garrett's instincts were leaning toward the latter. They pushed through Ohio and Indiana, stopping only for gas and quick bathroom breaks, making the kind of time that police officers could get away with on interstate highways. The Suburban's speedometer hovered consistently above 80, and Garrett was grateful for the FBI credentials that would prevent any state trooper from issuing them a ticket, even if they were pulled over. By the time the Chicago skyline appeared on the horizon, it was approaching 8 p.m., and the city lights were beginning to glow against the darkening sky. The Federal Plaza building loomed above the downtown streets, all glass and steel and institutional authority, containing within its walls both the legitimate law enforcement operations that protected the public and the corrupt network that had infiltrated and perverted those operations. Garrett parked in the secure garage, and they took the elevator up to the 14th floor, where Declan Price's office was located. The building felt different now, charged with a paranoia that made Garrett see threats in every face they passed, wonder about the loyalties of every agent they encountered. It was an exhausting way to exist, constantly questioning and second-guessing, and he understood why Marcus Bellamy had chosen retirement and distance over continuing to work within a compromised system. Price was waiting for them in his office, along with someone Garrett didn't immediately recognize. The stranger was a woman in her early 40s, dressed in a dark suit that marked her as either FBI or federal prosecutor, with short blonde hair and eyes that assessed Garrett and Elias with professional intensity. Price made introductions without preamble. "This is Special Agent Sutton Hale from the Bureau's Office of Professional Responsibility. She's here because while you were in New York, we found Ronan Claiborne. He's alive, but he's not in good condition, and what he's been saying since we recovered him has created a situation that requires immediate attention." The news hit Garrett like a physical impact. Ronan was alive. After everything they'd learned, all the parallels to Larkin Thorne's disappearance, all the assumptions about what the network did to agents who got too close to their secrets, Ronan Claiborne was still alive. The relief was immediate and overwhelming, but it was quickly tempered by Price's mention of "not in good condition," and the presence of an agent from the Office of Professional Responsibility, the Internal Affairs Division that investigated misconduct by FBI personnel. This wasn't just a rescue, it was something far more complicated, and Garrett felt his earlier relief curdling into apprehension about what came next. Special Agent Sutton Hale gestured for Garrett and Elias to take seats, her expression professional but carrying an undercurrent of something that looked like wariness. She was the kind of agent who'd built a career on investigating other agents, which meant she'd seen every variation of misconduct, corruption, and betrayal that could occur within the Bureau. The fact that she was here, in Declan Price's office, discussing Ronan Claiborne's recovery suggested this situation was far outside normal parameters. Garrett sat, feeling the exhaustion of the past 48 hours settling into his bones, but his mind was sharp with anticipation and dread about what he was about to hear. Agent Claiborne was found approximately 6 hours ago in a building on South Halsted Street. Hale began, pulling out a tablet and displaying crime scene photographs. The building is a former automotive repair facility, abandoned for at least a decade. An anonymous call came into 911 reporting screaming coming from inside. Chicago PD responded and found Claiborne restrained in a basement room. He'd been there for at least 2 days based on his physical condition, possibly longer. The photographs showed a concrete room with a single chair bolted to the floor, restraints still attached, and evidence of sustained captivity. Bloodstains on the concrete, water bottles scattered around, and a bucket that had clearly served as a makeshift toilet painted a picture of deliberate imprisonment. Garrett studied the images, his jaw tightening. Ronan had been held somewhere for days, restrained and isolated, and the implications were clear. This wasn't a kidnapping for ransom or a spur-of-the-moment abduction. This was interrogation, someone trying to extract information about what Ronan knew and who he'd shared it with. "What's his physical condition?" Elias asked, and Hale swiped to medical photographs that made both agents wince. Ronan's face was bruised and swollen, his wrists showed deep ligature marks, and there were burn patterns on his arms consistent with electrical shock devices. "He's at Northwestern Memorial Hospital under guard," Hale said. "Multiple contusions, 2 cracked ribs, severe dehydration, and psychological trauma consistent with sustained interrogation under duress. The doctors say he'll recover physically, but the psychological impact is going to take longer to assess." She paused, and her expression shifted into something harder. "What makes this situation particularly concerning is what Agent Claiborne has been saying since he was recovered. He's been making allegations about FBI personnel being involved in his abduction and interrogation. Specifically, he claims that his captors included at least 2 individuals he recognized as federal agents." The room went silent. Garrett felt something cold settle in his stomach, confirmation of what he'd already suspected but had hoped wasn't true. Ronan had been taken by people within the Bureau, people he'd worked alongside, people who'd used their insider knowledge to grab him from that warehouse and hold him for days, while they tried to determine how much damage he could do to their operation. "Did he identify them?" Garrett asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Hale's expression was carefully neutral. "He's provided descriptions and some contextual details, but he hasn't named specific individuals yet. His mental state has been unstable since recovery, alternating between lucidity and paranoia. The doctors have him sedated to prevent him from injuring himself or others. What he has been clear about is that his captors were asking detailed questions about the Larkin Thorne case, about what files he'd accessed, and about whether he'd shared his findings with anyone else." She looked directly at Garrett. "Your name came up repeatedly in those interrogation sessions. They wanted to know what you knew and whether you were actively investigating based on information Claiborne had provided. So, the network knew that Garrett was involved, knew that Ronan had likely shared information with him before disappearing. That explained the surveillance, the threats, the attempts at intimidation. They'd been trying to determine how much Garrett had discovered independently versus how much had come from Ronan, trying to assess whether eliminating one agent would be sufficient or whether they needed to expand their response. The anonymous caller's warnings, the tracking devices in his vehicle, the surveillance at Marcus Bellamy's townhouse, all of it had been about gathering intelligence on how much the network's security had been compromised. Declan Price spoke for the first time since the briefing began, his voice carrying the weight of someone who'd been dealing with this situation for hours, while Garrett and Elias were driving back from New York. "Agent Hale is here because the Office of Professional Responsibility needs to investigate Claiborne's allegations. If federal agents were involved in kidnapping and torturing another agent, we're looking at criminal conspiracy charges that go far beyond simple corruption. But the investigation is complicated by the fact that we don't know who can be trusted. Anyone in this building could potentially be part of whatever network Claiborne stumbled onto. Hale nodded, taking over the explanation. That's where you two come in. Supervisory Special Agent Price has briefed me on your investigation into Claiborne's disappearance, including the surveillance operation you discovered and the information you received from retired Special Agent Marcus Bellamy. Based on that briefing, I believe you're the only agents currently working this case who we can be reasonably confident aren't compromised, which means I need you to continue your investigation, but now with official authorization and resources from my office. It was simultaneously a relief and a burden. Relief because they'd have legitimate backing for their investigation instead of operating in the shadows. Burden because they were now the point of the spear in an internal investigation that would almost certainly result in violence before it was finished. Agents who'd gone far enough to kidnap and torture a colleague weren't going to surrender peacefully when exposed. They'd fight back with everything they had, using their knowledge of bureau procedures and their access to resources to protect themselves. This was going to get worse before it got better. "What do you need from us?" Garrett asked, the same question he'd posed to Price 2 days earlier, but now carrying different implications. Hale pulled up a document on her tablet and turned it so they could read. Agent Claiborne mentioned a specific location during his interrogation, a place his captors discussed as being significant to the larger operation. He couldn't remember the exact address, but he described it as an industrial complex near the Chicago River on the south side, possibly a former steel processing facility. Does that match anything from your investigation? Garrett felt electricity run through him. That description matched almost exactly with the location Marcus Bellamy had marked on his hand-drawn map. The place the retired agent had suggested might be where Larkin Thorne's body was hidden. The convergence of information from two completely independent sources meant the location was genuinely significant, not just speculation. "It matches intelligence we received in New York," Garrett said carefully, not wanting to reveal too much about Bellamy's involvement until he knew more about Hale's full agenda. "We were planning to investigate that location when we returned to Chicago." Hale's eyes sharpened with interest. "Then that's where we start. I want a full tactical team on standby, but I want you two to do the initial reconnaissance. If this location is as significant as it appears, the people protecting it will have surveillance and early warning systems. A large FBI presence would tip them off and give them time to sanitize whatever's there. But two agents doing what appears to be routine investigation might slip under their radar long enough to determine what we're dealing with." She looked between Garrett and Elias. "I won't lie to you, this is dangerous. If you're right about the scope of this network, they've already demonstrated willingness to kill federal agents who threaten them. Going to this location is going to put you directly in their crosshairs." Elias spoke up, his voice carrying the flat determination Garrett had come to associate with his partner when he'd made a decision that wouldn't be changed. "We're already in their crosshairs. They've been surveilling us for months, threatened us, tracked our movements, monitored our communications. At this point, not investigating is just as dangerous as investigating because they already see us as threats. Might as well earn their paranoia by actually finding something useful." Hale allowed herself a slight smile, the kind that suggested she appreciated competence and courage when she saw it. "Fair point, all right? Here's how this is going to work. You'll conduct reconnaissance of the industrial complex tonight. I'm assigning you encrypted communications equipment that runs on a separate frequency from standard bureau channels, so our conversations won't be intercepted by anyone monitoring normal FBI communications. You'll also have a panic button that goes directly to a tactical team I'm positioning nearby. The moment you find something significant or encounter hostile contact, you activate that button and extract immediately. No heroics, no attempts to handle things yourselves. You find evidence, you document it, you get out. Understood?" They both nodded, and Hale began outlining the operational details. The encrypted radios were military-grade equipment, the kind used for special operations where communication security was paramount. The panic button was a simple device, disguised as a car key fob, that would transmit an emergency beacon to the tactical team, along with GPS coordinates. The team itself would consist of agents from the FBI's Critical Incident Response Group, specialists who were trained for high-risk operations and who Hale had personally vetted for this assignment. It was as much security as could be provided given the circumstances, though Garrett understood that no amount of preparation could guarantee safety when investigating people who'd already proven they were willing to kill. By 10 p.m., Garrett and Elias were equipped and briefed, driving south through Chicago's industrial corridors in yet another replacement vehicle, this time a nondescript Ford Explorer that looked like any of 1,000 civilian SUVs on city streets. The industrial complex was located in a neighborhood that had been thriving in the 1970s, but had collapsed along with American manufacturing, leaving behind acres of abandoned factories and warehouses. The specific facility they were targeting had been a steel processing plant called Midwest Forge and Steel, shut down in 1986 and left to decay for nearly 40 years. The complex sprawled across 12 acres, surrounded by a chain-link fence that was mostly collapsed or breached in multiple locations. Warning signs about hazardous materials and structural instability were faded and pockmarked with rust, ignored by the occasional urban explorers and homeless population that used these spaces. Garrett parked the Explorer 2 blocks away, and they approached on foot, moving quietly through the darkness with their flashlights off until they were inside the fence line. The main building was a massive structure, 5 stories of steel framework and concrete, with most of its windows broken and its roof partially collapsed. They entered through a loading dock that had been forced open years ago, stepping into a vast industrial space filled with rusted machinery and debris. The smell was overwhelming, a mixture of decay, chemical residue, and something organic that suggested animals or possibly human squatters had used this space. Their flashlights cut through the darkness, revealing an industrial cathedral of abandoned American manufacturing, all twisted metal and shattered concrete. Nature slowly reclaiming what humans had built and then deserted. According to the architectural records, there are 3 sub-basements beneath this building, Garrett said quietly, consulting a schematic he'd pulled from city archives. If someone wanted to hide something here, that's where they'd put it. Underground, protected from casual observation, accessible but not obvious. They found a stairwell that descended into darkness, its metal stairs groaning under their weight but holding as they went down. The first sub-basement was flooded with about 6 inches of water, making their progress slow and loud despite their attempts at stealth. The second sub-basement was drier, and here they found the first indication that someone had been using this facility recently. Fresh tire tracks in the dust, leading to what had been a freight elevator shaft. Someone had been bringing vehicles down here, heavy vehicles based on the tread patterns, within the past few weeks. Garrett photographed the tracks with his phone, documenting everything as Hale had instructed. They followed the tracks deeper into the complex, moving through a maze of corridors and rooms that had once housed industrial equipment but were now empty except for debris and graffiti. It was Elias who found the door. It was a heavy steel security door, completely out of place in the industrial decay surrounding it, new enough that it gleamed dully in their flashlight beams. The door had an electronic lock, sophisticated equipment that had no business being in an abandoned building. Garrett pulled out the panic button, wanting to have it ready because this was clearly something significant. "This is what we came for," he said quietly. "Question is, do we try to open it, or do we call in the tactical team right now?" Before Elias could answer, the decision was made for them. The door swung open from the inside, and a figure emerged holding a flashlight of their own. The beam hit Garrett directly in the eyes, blinding him momentarily, and a familiar voice spoke from behind the light. "I was wondering when you'd get here. You've been predictable, Voss, following exactly the path we knew you'd follow." The voice was calm, almost friendly, and it took Garrett a moment to place it because the context was so wrong. Then recognition hit him like a physical blow. The man holding the flashlight was Declan Price. Garrett's mind raced through the implications, trying to reconcile what he was seeing with everything he thought he knew. Price had been the one to create the compartmented investigation, had given them access to the Larkin Thorne file, had authorized their trip to interview Marcus Bellamy. He'd seemed like an ally, a supervisor trying to help them navigate a dangerous situation. But now he was here, in an abandoned industrial complex, emerging from behind a security door that shouldn't exist. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Price hadn't been helping them investigate the network. He'd been managing them, controlling their investigation, ensuring they went exactly where he wanted them to go. "Declan," Garrett said, his hand moving toward his service weapon. Price made a dismissive gesture. "Don't. You're not going to shoot me. And even if you tried, you wouldn't make it out of this building. There are 6 armed individuals positioned throughout this facility, all with clear lines of fire on your current location. This isn't a confrontation, Voss. This is a conversation that's long overdue." He stepped aside, gesturing toward the open door. "Come inside, both of you. I want you to understand what you've actually been investigating before we discuss what happens next." Garrett exchanged a glance with Elias, and he could see his partner's hand was also near his weapon, body tensed for violence. But Price was right about the tactical situation. If they were already surrounded, drawing weapons would just precipitate a firefight they couldn't win. Better to see what Price wanted to show them, to understand the situation fully before making any moves. Garrett activated the panic button in his pocket, a discreet press that would alert Sutton Hale's tactical team. Then he and Elias followed Price through the security door. The space beyond was shockingly different from the industrial decay they'd been moving through. This was a fully operational facility, climate-controlled and well-lit, with modern equipment and active workstations. It looked like a command center, with computer terminals, surveillance monitors, and communication equipment that rivaled what was in the Federal Plaza building. A half-dozen people were working at various stations, all of them turning to look as Garrett and Elias entered. Several of them Garrett recognized as FBI agents from the Chicago field office. Others were unfamiliar, but they carried themselves with the confidence of law enforcement or military personnel. Price walked to a central console and pulled up something on one of the large monitors. It showed a map of the United States with dozens of markers spread across major cities. "This is what Special Agent Larkin Thorne discovered in '97, he said, his voice taking on a lecturer's tone. "This is what got her killed, what got Ronan Claiborne tortured, and what you two have been stumbling toward for the past 3 days. It's a network, Voss, but not the criminal conspiracy you've been imagining. This is a counterintelligence operation, running continuously for 37 years, designed to identify and neutralize threats to national security that operate within American law enforcement." He zoomed in on Chicago, and Garrett could see multiple layers of information displayed. "The Chicago Police Department corruption you investigated in '97? That was real, but it was also cover for something else. Several of those corrupt officers were actually foreign intelligence assets, using their positions to recruit other compromised individuals and funnel classified information to hostile governments. The FBI investigation threatened to expose them before we'd fully mapped their network, before we knew everyone involved. So we had to shut it down and eliminate the investigator who was getting too close. Larkin Thorne was collateral damage in a larger operation." Garrett felt his world tilting, trying to process what Price was telling him. "You're saying Larkin Thorne was killed to protect a counterintelligence operation? That you murdered a federal agent to keep her from exposing foreign spies?" Price turned away from the monitor, his expression grave. "I'm saying we made a choice between one agent's life and the security of a multi-year operation that has prevented dozens of terrorist attacks and espionage operations. It wasn't personal, it was mathematics. One life versus thousands. That's the calculation we make here every day in situations where there's no good answer." Elias spoke up, his voice tight with controlled fury. "And Ronan Claiborne? What mathematics justified torturing him?" Price's expression shifted, showing what might have been genuine regret. Claiborne wasn't supposed to be tortured. That was an operational failure. He was supposed to be detained long enough for us to determine what he'd discovered and whether he'd compromised any active operations. The individuals conducting his interrogation exceeded their authority. They've been disciplined. The casual way he said it, as if torture and discipline were administrative matters, made Garrett's skin crawl. "You're telling me that the FBI has been running an illegal counterintelligence operation for 37 years, killing and detaining its own agents to maintain security?" Garrett said, his voice carrying disbelief. Price shook his head. "Not the FBI. This facility and the operation it represents exist outside the normal bureau structure. We recruit from the FBI, from the CIA, from military intelligence, from any agency that produces competent personnel who understand the real threats facing this country. We operate without congressional oversight, without judicial review, because those institutions have been so thoroughly compromised by foreign influence that they can't be trusted with this level of classified information." He pulled up another screen, this one showing personnel files. Garrett recognized several faces, agents he'd worked with, people he'd trusted. "Everyone you see here volunteered for this assignment. We didn't force them or blackmail them. We showed them the evidence of how deeply foreign intelligence has penetrated American institutions, and we gave them a choice. Continue working within a compromised system, or join an operation that's actually protecting national security. Most chose to help. Some, like Larkin Thorne, chose to expose us and had to be removed. A few, like you and Drummond, are still deciding." The implications were staggering and terrifying. If what Price was saying was true, then the paranoia Garrett had felt over the past days was actually justified. Law enforcement agencies were compromised. The judicial system was compromised. Congressional oversight was compromised. And this shadow organization had taken it upon themselves to operate outside all legal frameworks, making life and death decisions without accountability, justified by a threat assessment that Garrett had no way to verify. It was either the most important national security operation in American history, or it was the most dangerous abuse of power imaginable. And he had no way to determine which. "Why are you telling us this?" Elias asked. "If we're a threat to your operation, why not just eliminate us like you did Larkin Thorne?" Price smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Because I think you're both smart enough to understand the necessity of what we do here. I think if you see the evidence, if you understand the scope of the threat we're fighting, you'll make the right choice. And if you do, you'll be valuable assets. You've already demonstrated investigative skill, operational security, and willingness to pursue truth regardless of personal cost. Those are exactly the qualities we need." He gestured to a door on the opposite side of the command center. "Through there is an archive. Classified documents showing foreign intelligence penetration of American institutions. Wiretap transcripts of compromised officials coordinating with hostile governments. Financial records showing money flowing from foreign intelligence services to American law enforcement and political figures. I want you to review those materials. Take your time, ask questions, and then decide whether you want to join us or whether you want to remain ignorant of how bad the situation really is." Garrett looked at Elias, and he could see his partner's expression mirroring his own uncertainty. This could be legitimate, a necessary evil protecting the country from threats that conventional law enforcement couldn't address. Or it could be an elaborate justification for a criminal conspiracy, a way to rationalize murder and corruption by wrapping it in national security rhetoric. The only way to know would be to review the evidence Price was offering. But accepting that invitation meant stepping deeper into something they might not be able to escape from. "What if we review the evidence and decide we don't want to be part of this?" Garrett asked. Price's expression became unreadable. "Then we'll have a different conversation about operational security and how to proceed. But I don't think that's going to happen. I think you're both going to recognize that everything you've seen over the past 3 days, all the surveillance and intimidation and threats, it was necessary to protect something more important than individual comfort. We don't have the luxury of operating within legal constraints because our enemies certainly don't." The sound of approaching sirens made everyone in the command center tense. Price glanced at a monitor showing exterior surveillance feeds, and his expression tightened. "You activated a panic button. Clever. Sutton Hale's tactical team will be here in approximately 3 minutes. He turned back to Garrett and Elias. "Here's what's going to happen. You're going to tell them you found an abandoned room with some old surveillance equipment. Nothing significant. You're going to report that I was conducting my own investigation of this facility and you encountered me during your reconnaissance. Everything else you saw here, all these people, this equipment, this operation, you're going to forget it exists." "And if we don't?" Elias asked. Price's expression hardened. "Then we'll discover that Agent Hale's tactical team was compromised by the same network that took Ronan Claiborne. There will be a firefight, people will die, and you two will be among the casualties. We don't want that outcome, but we're prepared for it if necessary. The operation is more important than any individual lives, including yours and mine." The ultimatum was clear. Cooperate with the cover story, or face lethal consequences. Garrett felt the weight of the decision crushing down on him. Everything he'd believed about law and justice and institutional integrity was being challenged. Price might be telling the truth about foreign intelligence penetration, about the necessity of operating outside legal frameworks to protect national security. Or he might be a sophisticated liar who'd wrapped criminal conspiracy in patriotic rhetoric. Garrett had no way to know which, and he had about 60 seconds to decide how to respond before Hale's team breached the facility. He thought about Ronan Claiborne, tortured and traumatized but alive. He thought about Larkin Thorne, dead for 27 years because she'd gotten too close to this operation. He thought about Marcus Bellamy, forced into retirement and silence, carrying the weight of unanswered questions for decades. And he thought about the oath he'd taken when he joined the FBI, to uphold the Constitution and protect the American people. The question was whether this shadow organization represented the fulfillment of that oath or the betrayal of it. The tactical team was moving through the building above them, boots thundering on metal stairs, voices calling out tactical positions. Price was watching Garrett with the intensity of someone whose life might depend on the next few words spoken. All around them, the personnel in the command center were preparing for potential violence, hands moving toward the weapons, bodies shifting into defensive positions, the moment balanced on a knife's edge, and Garrett's next words would determine whether it tipped toward cooperation or bloodshed. "We found an old surveillance room," Garrett said slowly, his eyes locked on Price's face. "Looks like it was used for some kind of operation years ago, but it's been inactive for a while. Nothing current, nothing actionable." Price's shoulders released tension Garrett hadn't realized he was holding, and around the room, people relaxed fractionally. "That's what we found too," Price said. "Just an old Cold War-era facility, probably used for something classified back in the day, not relevant to our current investigation." The tactical team burst through the security door 30 seconds later, weapons raised and scanning for threats. They found 3 FBI agents standing in an empty room with old computer equipment, looking at architectural plans and discussing the building's history. Special Agent Sutton Hale was with them, her eyes taking in every detail, clearly sensing that something wasn't right but unable to identify exactly what. She looked at Garrett and he met her gaze steadily, committing himself to the lie he'd just told because the alternative was too dangerous to contemplate. They spent another hour at the facility, with Hale's team conducting a thorough search that found absolutely nothing because the command center had disappeared behind walls that looked like solid concrete, concealed by mechanisms that Garrett couldn't even identify. Price played his role perfectly. The concerned supervisor who'd been conducting his own investigation and happened to encounter his agents during their reconnaissance. It was a performance that would have been impressive if it weren't so terrifying in its implications. By 3 a.m., they were back at the Federal Plaza building, filing reports about a dead-end investigation that had produced no actionable intelligence. Sutton Hale was frustrated but accepted their findings, already moving on to other aspects of the investigation into Ronan Claiborne's abduction. The case would continue, but it would go in directions that would never quite reach the truth because the people controlling the investigation were the same ones who'd committed the crimes. Garrett sat in his apartment at dawn, watching the sun rise over Chicago and thinking about the choice he'd made. He'd protected a shadow organization that might be defending national security, or might be the most dangerous criminal conspiracy in American history. He'd lied to a federal investigator and helped cover up evidence of serious crimes. He'd become complicit in the very corruption he'd sworn to fight. And he'd done it because the alternative, triggering a firefight that would have killed him, Elias, and probably several members of the tactical team, had seemed worse in the moment. His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. He opened it to find a single line of text. "You made the right choice. The evidence you wanted to see will be delivered within 48 hours. Welcome to the real fight." Garrett deleted the message, then sat staring at his phone, wondering if he'd just saved his life or condemned his soul. Ronan Claiborne was alive and would recover. That was something. But Larkin Thorne was still dead, and the people responsible for her murder were still operating with impunity, protected by layers of secrecy and justified by national security claims that might or might not be legitimate. The city spread out below his window, millions of people going about their lives, unaware of the shadows that moved beneath the surface. Somewhere in Chicago, Declan Price was also watching the sunrise, satisfied that he'd managed another threat to his operation. And somewhere in that same city, there were probably foreign intelligence assets doing exactly what Price claimed, undermining American institutions from within, protected by the very legal constraints that made it so difficult to stop them. Garrett didn't know what truth looked like anymore. He didn't know who the good guys were or whether such categories even applied to the world he'd discovered. All he knew was that he'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross, made a choice he couldn't unmake, and would spend however long remained of his career trying to determine whether he'd made the right decision or had simply become another agent compromised by fear and uncertainty. The sun continued to rise, indifferent to human struggles over truth and justice. Chicago woke up to another day, and in the Federal Plaza building, agents who might be heroes or villains or something in between prepared to continue a war that most people would never know was being fought. Garrett Voss was now one of them, for better or worse, and the only way forward was deeper into the darkness, hoping that eventually there would be light on the other side. But in the quiet of his apartment, watching the city come alive, Garrett suspected that hope was probably a lie he was telling himself to justify the unjustifiable. Some doors, once opened, could never be closed. Some truths, once learned, could never be unlearned. And some choices, once made, defined everything that came after. He'd made his choice in that underground facility, and now he would have to live with the consequences, whatever they turned out to be. The investigation into Agent Ronan Claiborne's disappearance was officially closed 2 weeks later, attributed to a criminal organization that was never fully identified. Ronan himself took medical leave and eventually transferred to a desk position in the FBI's training division, far from fieldwork and the dangers that came with it. Marcus Bellamy called once to say he was safe, but wouldn't be contacting them again. And Declan Price continued running the Chicago field office's criminal investigation division. His secrets intact, his operation protected, his agents never quite sure whether they were serving justice or participating in its corruption. Some mysteries remained unsolved, not because the truth couldn't be found, but because finding it required accepting answers that no one wanted to live with. Garrett Voss had found his answer, and it had changed him in ways he was still trying to understand. The question that would haunt him for the rest of his career was simple. Had he made the right choice? He suspected he would never know for certain. On the morning of November 9th, 2024, Field Agent Marcellus Crane received a call from the Chicago FBI field office at 7:23 a.m. The voice on the other end belonged to Supervisory Special Agent Declan Price, and his tone carried the clipped urgency that meant something significant had happened overnight. "Crane, I need you at the office within the hour. We've got a situation that requires your specific expertise." Marcellus didn't ask for details over the phone. After 12 years with the Bureau, 8 of them specializing in cold case investigations, he'd learned that certain conversations only happened face-to-face in secure facilities. He was in his car and heading toward the Federal Plaza building 15 minutes later, navigating through morning rush-hour traffic with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd made this drive hundreds of times. The Chicago skyline was gray under November clouds, the kind of overcast morning that made the city feel compressed and claustrophobic. Marcellus had grown up in Chicago, specifically in the Bronzeville neighborhood, and he knew the city's moods the way other people knew music. Today's mood was somber, appropriate for whatever case had prompted Price's early morning call. He'd worked with Price for 5 years, and the man didn't summon agents for trivial matters. If Price wanted him in the office urgently, it meant they'd caught a case that was either politically sensitive or operationally complex, possibly both. The Federal Plaza building loomed above South Dearborn Street, all glass and concrete authority. Marcellus parked in the secure garage and took the elevator to the 14th floor, where the Criminal Investigation Division maintained its offices. Price's office door was open, and through it, Marcellus could see 2 other people already present. One was a woman he didn't recognize, late 20s or early 30s with auburn hair pulled back in a ponytail, and the kind of intense focus in her eyes that suggested either extreme intelligence or barely contained obsession. The other was Price himself, standing by the window with his arms crossed, looking like a man who'd been dealing with bureaucratic headaches since well before sunrise. "Crane, come in and close the door," Price said without preamble. Marcellus did so, taking a seat in one of the chairs facing Price's desk. The unknown woman glanced at him with an assessing look, and Price made introductions. "This is Ivy Langston, forensic analyst on loan to us from the Behavioral Analysis Unit at Quantico. She's been working on a project that intersects with a case you handled 3 years ago. Ivy, this is Field Agent Marcellus Crane, one of our best cold case investigators." The mention of a case from 3 years ago immediately narrowed the possibilities in Marcellus's mind, and none of the options were pleasant. Ivy Langston spoke for the first time, her voice carrying a slight southern accent that suggested origins somewhere in the Carolinas or Georgia. Agent Crane, in 2021 you investigated the disappearance of a confidential informant named Vincent Mallory. The case was eventually closed as presumed deceased, but the body was never recovered and no arrests were made. Do you remember the details? Marcellus felt his jaw tighten. He remembered that case with painful clarity. Vincent Mallory had been providing information about organized crime connections to legitimate businesses in Chicago's industrial sector. Then, one day he'd simply vanished, and despite weeks of investigation, Marcellus had never been able to determine what happened to him, or even confirm that he was dead rather than in hiding. I remember, Marcellus said carefully. Mallory was solid as informants go. Reliable, careful, understood operational security. He was feeding us information about a trucking company that was being used to transport contraband. Mostly stolen goods, but possibly drugs as well. We were building a case, getting close to having enough for warrants, and then he disappeared. His apartment showed no signs of struggle. His car was found at O'Hare with a ticket to Phoenix, but he never boarded the plane. No financial activity after the disappearance. No communication with family or known associates. He just evaporated. The frustration of that unsolved case was still present, even after 3 years. It was the kind of investigation that stayed with an agent, the kind that made you question your competence and your judgment. Price pulled up something on his computer and turned the monitor so Marcellus could see. It was a crime scene photograph, recent based on the digital timestamp, showing the interior of what appeared to be a large industrial freezer. The walls were covered in frost, and the lighting was the harsh LED glare of emergency work lights brought in by investigators. In the center of the frame, partially embedded in ice that had accumulated over years, was a human hand. The skin was preserved by the cold, fingers curled slightly as if reaching for something. This photograph was taken yesterday evening at a facility on South Ashland Avenue, Price said. The building is a former cold storage warehouse, been abandoned since 2019 when the company that owned it went bankrupt. Chicago PD received an anonymous tip about squatters using the building and sent a patrol unit to check it out. What they found was a body frozen into the floor of one of the storage units. Ivy Langston took over the explanation, pulling up additional photographs on a tablet. The body is male, approximately 6 feet tall, estimated age at death between 35 and 45. Due to the preservation from cold storage, tissue samples were viable for DNA analysis. We ran the profile through CODIS and got a match to Vincent Mallory, the confidential informant from your 2021 case. He's been in that freezer for at least 3 years, possibly longer. The medical examiner is still working on determining exact time of death and cause, but preliminary examination shows trauma consistent with violent assault prior to death. Marcellus felt a complicated mixture of emotions. Vindication that his instinct about Mallory being dead rather than disappeared had been correct. Grief for a man he'd worked with, someone who'd trusted the FBI to protect him, and who'd ultimately paid for that trust with his life. And renewed determination to find whoever had killed him and left him in a freezer like a piece of forgotten meat. What do we know about the facility where he was found? Marcellus asked, already shifting into investigative mode, pushing the emotions aside to focus on the practical work of solving a murder. Price pulled up building records. The facility is called North Point Cold Storage. It was a commercial operation, renting freezer space to food distributors, pharmaceutical companies, anyone who needed temperature-controlled storage. The company filed for bankruptcy in 2019 after a series of health code violations and financial irregularities. The building has been sitting empty since then, technically owned by a bank that's been trying to sell it but hasn't found buyers because of environmental contamination issues. According to city records, the power was shut off in late 2019, but when Chicago PD entered the building yesterday, they found that several of the cold storage units were still operational, running on what appears to be an independent power source that's not connected to the city grid. That detail immediately raised red flags. Someone had been maintaining power to specific freezer units in an abandoned building for years, which suggested ongoing use rather than simple neglect. Have we identified who's been paying for that independent power? Marcellus asked. Ivy shook her head. That's one of several very concerning questions we don't have answers to yet. The power setup is sophisticated, using generators and battery systems that would require regular maintenance and fuel delivery. Someone has been actively managing that building, keeping those freezers operational for at least 5 years. The question is why, and what else besides Vincent Mallory's body might be stored there. Price stood and walked to his office door, checking that it was fully closed and that no one was in the corridor outside. When he returned, his expression was grave. This is where the case gets complicated. The building records show that North Point Cold Storage had several contracts with federal agencies, including the FBI. We used their facilities for evidence storage in cases involving perishable materials. Nothing classified, just standard chain of custody storage for organic evidence that needed to remain frozen. Those contracts ended when the company went bankrupt, and all our materials were relocated to approved facilities. But the fact that we had any connection to this location creates a situation where we need to be very careful about how we investigate. Marcellus understood the implication immediately. If a confidential informant had been murdered and stored in a facility that had FBI connections, even if those connections were routine and above board, it created optics problems. It also created the possibility that someone within the Bureau had been involved in Mallory's death, using knowledge of FBI storage facilities to hide the body. You think this was an inside job, Marcellus said, making it a statement rather than a question. Price's expression confirmed it. I think we need to investigate that possibility very carefully and very quietly, which is why I'm putting you in charge of this case with Langston as your forensic specialist. You'll report directly to me, no sharing with other divisions, and you'll maintain absolute operational security about what you find. It was the second time in recent weeks that Price had created a compartmented investigation, isolating sensitive cases from normal Bureau oversight. Marcellus didn't know about the other case involving missing agents, but he could sense that Price was operating under significant pressure, trying to manage multiple threats to Bureau integrity while maintaining the appearance of normal operations. What are my operational parameters? Marcellus asked. Price handed him a folder containing building plans and access credentials. You and Langston will conduct a thorough examination of the North Point facility. Document everything you find, every piece of evidence, every indication of who's been using that building and why. The Chicago PD has agreed to let us take lead on the investigation since it involves a federal informant. The crime scene is secured, but you'll have it to yourselves for as long as you need. Ivy Langston was already organizing her equipment. The focused intensity Marcellus had noticed earlier now directed toward practical preparation. I'll need to bring in specialized forensic equipment for processing a cold storage environment. The freezing will have preserved trace evidence that would normally degrade, but it also creates unique challenges for collection and analysis. We should plan on spending at least 48 hours on site doing preliminary documentation before we start any invasive procedures. She looked at Marcellus with an expression that suggested she was evaluating whether he was up to the task. How do you feel about working in sub-zero temperatures for extended periods? "I've worked in worse conditions," Marcellus said, which was true. He'd investigated crime scenes in abandoned buildings during Chicago winters, had processed evidence in unheated warehouses and open-air locations. Cold storage would be uncomfortable, but manageable with proper equipment. What concerns me more is the security situation. If someone has been maintaining that facility for years, they're not going to be happy about FBI agents crawling through it. We should assume hostile surveillance and plan accordingly. Ivy nodded approval, and Marcellus got the sense that she appreciated practical paranoia in her colleagues. By 10 a.m., they were equipped and briefed, driving south through Chicago's industrial corridor in a bureau vehicle loaded with forensic equipment. The North Point cold storage facility was located in an area that had once been thriving with food processing and distribution operations, but had declined as companies moved to suburban locations with better highway access. The building was a massive concrete structure, 3 stories tall and occupying an entire city block. From the outside, it looked like any of a dozen similar abandoned industrial buildings, windows broken or boarded up, graffiti covering the lower walls, chain-link fence surrounding the property with multiple breaches where urban explorers and homeless populations had forced entry. Chicago PD had a patrol car stationed at the main entrance, and Marcellus showed his credentials to the officer on duty. "FBI's taking lead on this one," the officer said, clearly relieved to be handing off responsibility for what was obviously a complicated case. "Fair warning, it's creepy as hell in there. We've been hearing noises from inside the building even though we've swept it multiple times and haven't found anyone. Probably just the building settling or animals, but it'll get under your skin if you're in there long enough." Marcellus appreciated the warning, filed it away as potentially significant. Noises in an abandoned building could be explained by natural causes, or they could indicate that someone was still using the facility and was avoiding police patrols. The interior of North Point cold storage was exactly as Marcellus expected from an abandoned industrial facility. The front offices were stripped of anything valuable, with papers scattered across floors and furniture left to decay. The air smelled of mold and chemical residue, that particular combination of scents that marked buildings where hazardous materials had been stored and never properly cleaned. They moved through the office area toward the main storage section, following building plans that showed a maze of corridors connecting dozens of individual cold storage units. The building had been designed for maximum efficiency, with minimal wasted space, which meant navigating through narrow passages with limited sight lines and multiple blind corners. The first cold storage unit they examined was unpowered and appeared to have been unused for years. The door stood open and inside was empty except for metal shelving and residue from whatever had been stored there previously. The temperature was only slightly cooler than the surrounding building, nothing that would preserve biological materials. They continued deeper into the facility, checking each unit systematically, documenting the condition and contents. Most were similar to the first, empty and inactive. But as they moved toward the rear of the building, they began encountering units that were still powered, their refrigeration systems humming with steady mechanical efficiency. Ivy stopped at one such unit, checking a temperature gauge mounted outside the door. "This one is maintaining negative 20 degrees Fahrenheit. That's cold enough for long-term biological preservation." She pulled out her tablet and referenced the building plans. According to these schematics, this unit and 3 others in this section were part of the FBI's contracted storage. They would have held evidence from various cases, probably blood samples, tissue samples, organic materials that needed to remain frozen for potential future analysis. She looked at Marcellus. If someone was using bureau storage for criminal purposes, these would be the most logical units. They opened the door carefully, feeling the blast of frigid air that rolled out like a physical force. Inside, the unit was approximately 20 feet by 30 feet, with metal shelving along the walls. Most of the shelves were empty, but several still held plastic containers marked with evidence tags and case numbers. Marcellus photographed everything before touching anything, documenting the scene exactly as they found it. The evidence containers appeared legitimate, with proper chain of custody labels and seals that looked intact. But that didn't necessarily mean everything in this unit was legitimate bureau evidence. Someone with inside knowledge could easily create convincing forgeries of evidence labels and seals. The unit where Vincent Mallory's body had been found was at the far end of the building, isolated from the other active storage areas. When they reached it, Marcellus understood why the Chicago PD officer had described the scene as creepy. The unit's door had been left open by investigators, and emergency work lights illuminated an interior that looked like something from a nightmare. Ice had accumulated on every surface, layers upon layers built up over years of operation. The freezer's walls were barely visible beneath thick frost, and the floor was covered in ice that had frozen into uneven ridges and valleys, creating a treacherous walking surface. Vincent Mallory's body was in the center of the unit, exactly where it had been discovered. The medical examiner's team had carefully excavated the ice around the body enough to confirm identity and gather preliminary evidence, but they'd left the remains in place for FBI processing. Marcellus could see why they'd made that decision. Removing the body from its ice tomb would be a delicate operation, requiring careful excavation to preserve any evidence that might be trapped in the frozen layers. This was going to be days of meticulous work in sub-zero conditions, and there was no guarantee they'd find anything useful. Ivy was already setting up equipment, portable lighting and cameras to document the scene from multiple angles. "The ice preservation is actually fortunate from a forensic perspective," she said, her breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "DNA will be extremely well preserved. Trace evidence like fibers or hair will be intact. If his killers left any biological evidence on the body, we'll find it." She moved closer to the remains, studying them with clinical detachment. "The way he's positioned suggests he was placed here deliberately after death, rather than killed in this location. See how his arms are folded across his chest? That's not a natural position for someone who died violently. Someone arranged him that way." Marcellus studied the positioning, seeing what Ivy meant. It looked almost ritualistic, the way Mallory had been laid out. His arms were crossed, his legs were straight, his head was tilted slightly back. It reminded Marcellus of how bodies were arranged in caskets for viewing, a formal presentation rather than the chaotic positioning typical of violent death. This wasn't just disposal, Marcellus said. Whoever did this was making a statement. They wanted him preserved, wanted him found eventually. Otherwise, why maintain power to this unit for 3 years? Why not just dump the body somewhere it would never be discovered? Ivy nodded slowly, and Marcellus could see her mind working through the implications. "You're suggesting this is a message, but to whom? And what's the message?" Those were exactly the questions Marcellus had been asking himself. If Vincent Mallory's murder was meant to send a message, then understanding that message was crucial to identifying the killers. The informant had been investigating organized crime connections to Chicago's industrial sector. His information had been moving the FBI toward criminal indictments. Someone had decided he was too dangerous to live, but instead of simply making him disappear, they'd preserved his body and arranged for it to eventually be discovered. That suggested a level of confidence bordering on arrogance, a belief that they could murder a federal informant and face no consequences. They spent the next 4 hours documenting the scene, taking hundreds of photographs and measurements, building a comprehensive record before they began the process of excavating the body. Ivy set up a portable generator to power additional lighting and heating equipment, creating a workspace where they could conduct detailed forensic examination despite the freezing conditions. As they worked, Marcellus became aware of the sounds the Chicago PD officer had mentioned. The building was never quite silent. There were the mechanical hums of the active refrigeration units, but beyond that were other noises that were harder to explain. Creaks and groans that could be structural settling but sometimes sounded almost like footsteps. Distant, metallic sounds that might be pipes contracting in the cold, or might be doors opening and closing in other parts of the facility. "You hear that?" Marcellus asked during one particularly clear metallic clang that seemed to come from somewhere above them. Ivy paused in her work, listening. "I hear it. Could be anything in a building this old and this poorly maintained. Could also be someone else in here with us." She reached into her equipment bag and pulled out a sidearm, checking it with practiced efficiency before holstering it again. "I don't believe in taking chances with site security, especially when we're working a case that might involve bureau corruption. If someone doesn't want us finding what's in this building, we're very vulnerable down here." Marcellus pulled his own weapon and did a quick security sweep of the immediate area, checking the corridors and adjacent storage units. Everything appeared empty, but the building's layout created dozens of places where someone could observe them without being seen. The narrow corridors, the multiple levels, the maze-like arrangement of storage units, all of it meant they couldn't be certain they were alone. "We should work in shifts," Marcellus said. "One person processing evidence, one person maintaining security and watching for threats. It'll slow us down, but it's better than being caught unprepared if someone decides to make a move against us." They settled into a rhythm, alternating between evidence processing and security duties. Ivy proved to be as competent with situational awareness as she was with forensic analysis, suggesting a background that included field operations rather than just laboratory work. During one of Marcellus's security sweeps, he found something that made his blood run cold. In a corridor approximately 50 feet from where they were working, there were fresh footprints in the dust and debris covering the floor. The prints were recent, made within the past few hours based on how the disturbed dust had settled. Someone had been walking through this building since the Chicago PD had secured it. Someone who'd managed to avoid the patrol officers and had gotten close enough to observe Marcellus and Ivy's investigation. He photographed the prints and returned to show Ivy. Her expression tightened as she studied the images. Boot prints, probably size 10 or 11. Single person, moving carefully but not attempting to hide their passage. That suggests either confidence or a lack of concern about being detected. She looked at Marcellus. "We need to assume we're under active surveillance. Whoever made these prints is watching us right now, probably has been since we arrived. The question is whether they're just observing or planning something more aggressive." Marcellus made a decision. "We call it in. Get additional bureau personnel out here for security, establish a proper perimeter, and make it clear that this is an active FBI investigation with serious resources behind it. If someone's watching us, let them see that we're not isolated and vulnerable." He pulled out his phone to call Price, but before he could dial, the lights in their section of the building went out. The portable generator kept their immediate work area illuminated, but the corridor lights and the emergency exit signs all died simultaneously, plunging the surrounding building into darkness. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Someone had cut the power, and they'd done it right after Marcellus discussed calling for backup, which meant their conversation had been monitored. The building wasn't just under surveillance, it was actively bugged with listening devices. Whoever was watching them had heard every word they'd said since arriving at the facility. Marcellus and Ivy moved instinctively into defensive positions, backs against walls, weapons drawn, covering different angles of approach. The generator's lights created a bubble of illumination in the darkness, but beyond that bubble was complete blackness that could hide any number of threats. "Federal agents," Marcellus called out, his voice carrying authority despite the fear coursing through him. "We know you're there. Show yourself and identify, or we will respond with appropriate force. There was no response, just the continued mechanical hum of the refrigeration units and those ambiguous sounds of a building that might or might not contain hostile actors. The silence stretched, seconds feeling like minutes, every shadow potentially concealing danger. Then a voice spoke from somewhere in the darkness beyond their lights, male, calm, and unnervingly casual. "Agent Crane, you're investigating something you don't understand. Vincent Mallory's death was justice, not murder. He betrayed people who trusted him, provided information that destroyed lives and livelihoods. What happened to him was proportional to his crimes. You should close this case and move on before you suffer the same consequences he did." The voice was coming from multiple directions simultaneously, suggesting either multiple speakers or someone using audio equipment to project from different locations. It was a psychological tactic designed to create disorientation and prevent them from identifying the speaker's true position. Marcellus kept his weapon steady, scanning for targets. Vincent Mallory was a federal informant under FBI protection. His murder is a federal crime. If you believe he wronged you, you should have pursued legal remedies. Now you're threatening federal agents in the commission of their duties, which adds additional charges. You need to surrender immediately. He was stalling, hoping that the time would allow them to identify the speaker's location, or at least understand the threat they were facing. But the voice just laughed, a sound that echoed through the building in ways that made it impossible to pinpoint. "Legal remedies," the voice repeated with obvious mockery. "You actually believe that, don't you? You think the system works, that justice can be achieved through proper channels." Vincent Mallory learned otherwise. So did the FBI agents who've been asking questions about cases that should have stayed closed. You're next on that list, Crane, unless you're smart enough to walk away while you still can. This building holds secrets that powerful people want kept hidden. Your badge won't protect you from consequences if you insist on exposing those secrets. The mention of FBI agents asking questions about closed cases made Marcellus think of the other investigation Price had been running, the one involving missing agents and surveillance operations. He'd been compartmented away from that case, but rumors circulated through the field office about agents disappearing and internal corruption investigations. If this situation was connected to those rumors, if the people behind Vincent Mallory's murder were the same ones who'd been targeting other federal agents, then Marcellus and Ivy were in significantly more danger than he'd initially assessed. Before he could respond, the generator powering their lights cut out abruptly, plunging them into complete darkness. In the sudden absence of light and the overwhelming hum of refrigeration equipment, Marcellus felt complete sensory disorientation. He couldn't see anything beyond the faint glow of emergency exit signs in the distance, couldn't identify threats or even locate Ivy's position with certainty. He moved by feel, keeping his back against the wall, weapon extended, every sense straining to detect approaching danger. This was the nightmare scenario every federal agent trained for, but hoped never to experience. Trapped in a hostile environment with unknown attackers and no clear avenue of escape. The darkness in the North Point cold storage facility was absolute and disorienting. Marcellus Crane felt his heart hammering against his ribs, every instinct screaming at him to move, to find cover, to do something other than stand exposed in blackness where hostile actors could approach from any direction. But moving blindly in an unfamiliar environment filled with equipment and obstacles was a recipe for injury or worse. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to think tactically rather than react emotionally. The darkness was a weapon being used against them, but it was also a constraint on whoever had cut the power. They couldn't see him any better than he could see them unless they had night vision equipment. which was possible but not certain. "Ivy," Marcellus called out softly, keeping his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry far, but loud enough for his partner to locate him. "Sound off." There was a pause that stretched too long, and Marcellus felt panic beginning to claw at his composure. Then Ivy's voice came from approximately 15 feet to his left, steady despite their circumstances. "I'm here. East wall, near the storage unit entrance. I've got thermal imaging on my phone. It's not perfect, but it'll show body heat signatures if anyone approaches." The relief Marcellus felt was immediate and profound. Thermal imaging gave them a significant tactical advantage, evening the odds against whoever was stalking them through the building. "Can you make it to my position?" Marcellus asked, already trying to calculate the safest way to reunite with his partner. Having two agents separated in darkness was tactically unsound, making them vulnerable to being isolated and overwhelmed individually. But Ivy's response made him reconsider. "Negative. I've got 3 heat signatures approximately 40 feet down the corridor, positioned to cut off direct approach between us. They're waiting for us to move, probably hoping we'll panic and make tactical errors. We need to maintain our current positions and call for backup before attempting any movement." Marcellus pulled out his phone, using his body to shield the screen's glow as he pulled up Declan Price's direct number. The phone showed no signal. That should have been impossible. They were in Chicago, not some remote wilderness area. Cell coverage was ubiquitous in the city, which meant someone was actively jamming their communications, using equipment sophisticated enough to create a localized dead zone without affecting the entire neighborhood and triggering immediate investigation. The level of technical capability required for that kind of operation suggested professional training and significant resources, not street criminals or even typical organized crime. "I've got no signal," Marcellus reported, keeping his voice low. "They're jamming us, which means they came prepared for federal agents, knew we'd try to call for backup, and had countermeasures ready. This isn't opportunistic. This is planned and coordinated." The implications were chilling. Whoever was behind this had known that FBI agents would be investigating the facility, had prepared an ambush with military-grade equipment, and was confident enough to directly confront federal law enforcement. That level of confidence suggested either desperation or protection from consequences, possibly both. Ivy's voice came through the darkness again, still remarkably calm given their situation. "I'm seeing movement on thermal. 2 of the signatures are advancing slowly, maintaining cover positions. The third is holding back, probably overwatch with a weapon. They're conducting a standard tactical approach, clearing corners and maintaining fields of fire. These people have training." Marcellus processed that information, his mind automatically running through response options. They couldn't retreat without knowing what was behind them. They couldn't advance without walking into prepared positions. They couldn't call for help. Their tactical options were severely limited. Then Marcellus remembered something from the building plans he'd reviewed that morning. This facility had been designed with safety protocols for cold storage operations, including emergency ventilation systems and backup power for critical life safety equipment. Those systems would have independent generators that should still be functional even if the main power was cut. If he could locate and activate the emergency systems, it would restore lighting and possibly even trigger automated alerts to fire departments or building management companies, bringing outside assistance even with communications jammed. "Ivy, the building plan showed emergency systems with independent power. Do you remember where the control panels were located?" There was a pause as Ivy accessed her digital copy of the plans on her phone, the faint glow of her screen giving Marcellus a point of reference for her position. "Northwest corner of this level, approximately 200 feet from our current position, but that means moving through the sections where our hostile contacts are positioned. We'd be advancing directly toward them." Marcellus thought through the geometry of their situation. If the hostile actors were positioned between them and the emergency systems, that actually created an opportunity. They expected the FBI agents to retreat or call for backup, not to advance toward a tactical objective. The surprise of an aggressive move might buy them crucial seconds. "Can you provide covering fire if I move on the control panel?" Marcellus asked. Ivy's response was immediate. "I can suppress their positions, but I can't guarantee hits in this visibility. You'll be exposed for the entire approach. Are you sure about this?" He wasn't sure about anything except that staying pinned in darkness while hostile actors maneuvered around them was a guaranteed path to disaster. "On my signal, put 3 rounds toward the closest heat signature, high enough to avoid hitting me, but close enough to make them seek cover. Then I move fast and direct toward the emergency panel. You maintain position and engage any targets that present themselves. If I make it to the panel and restore power, we'll have tactical advantage. If I don't make it, you extract and report what happened here." The plan was risky, but all their options were risky at this point. At least this way they were taking initiative rather than reacting to enemy actions. "Understood," Ivy said, and Marcellus could hear her shifting position slightly, preparing for what came next. He took 3 deep breaths, forcing his heart rate to slow, getting his body ready for explosive movement. His eyes had adjusted enough to the darkness that he could make out basic shapes, the slightly lighter patches that indicated emergency exit signs providing minimal orientation. He counted down from 3, and on 0, he barked out, "Execute!" Ivy's weapon discharged 3 times in rapid succession, the muzzle flash creating brief snapshots of the environment that burned into Marcellus's retinas. He saw the corridor, the storage unit doors, the approximate positions of their attackers seeking cover from Ivy's suppressing fire. Then he was moving, running in a crouch toward where the building plans had shown the emergency control panel, his own weapon extended but not firing, saving his ammunition for targets he could actually identify. Behind him, he heard Ivy fire twice more, heard someone curse in pain, suggesting at least one of her rounds had found a target. Marcellus covered the 200 feet in what felt like hours but was probably less than 30 seconds, his feet pounding on concrete, his breath harsh in his throat. He expected incoming fire at any moment, expected to feel the impact of bullets, but nothing came. Either Ivy's suppression was effective enough to keep their attackers pinned, or they weren't willing to risk killing a federal agent yet, still hoping to intimidate rather than escalate to murder. He reached the northwest corner and found the emergency panel exactly where the plans indicated. A metal box mounted on the wall with a clear protective cover. Marcellus smashed the cover with the butt of his weapon and hit the emergency activation switch. For a moment, nothing happened, and he thought the system might be as dead as everything else in this building. Then, with a grinding mechanical sound, emergency generators kicked on somewhere in the facility's depths. Lights began flickering to life throughout the building, fluorescent fixtures that had been dark for years suddenly illuminating corridors and storage areas. The effect was dramatic and immediate, transforming the environment from nightmare darkness to harsh industrial visibility. What Marcellus saw in that restored light made his blood run cold. The 3 hostile actors Ivy had identified on thermal imaging were now clearly visible, but they weren't who he'd expected. All 3 were wearing tactical gear that was immediately recognizable to anyone with law enforcement or military experience. Black BDUs with equipment vests, ballistic helmets, and weapons that were standard bureau issue. They were FBI agents, or at least people equipped exactly like FBI agents. One of them was bleeding from a shoulder wound where Ivy's suppressing fire had connected, but he was still mobile and armed. The wounded agent raised his hands slowly, letting his weapon hang from its sling. "Stand down, Crane. This doesn't have to escalate further. We're on the same side here." His voice was the same one that had spoken from the darkness earlier, and now Marcellus could place it. Special Agent Trevor Ashford, assigned to the Chicago Field Office's Organized Crime Division. Marcellus had worked with him on previous cases, had considered him a solid agent with good instincts and reliable follow-through. Seeing him here, part of an armed ambush against fellow agents, created a cognitive dissonance that Marcellus struggled to process. Marcellus kept his weapon trained on the other agent, not lowering it despite the hands-up gesture. What the hell is this? Why are you threatening federal agents conducting a legitimate investigation? Ashford's expression was a mixture of frustration and what might have been sympathy. Because this investigation isn't as legitimate as you think. Vincent Mallory wasn't just an informant, he was a foreign intelligence asset, using his position to gather information on FBI operations and passing that intelligence to hostile governments. His murder wasn't revenge or silencing a witness. It was a sanctioned elimination of a security threat. The words hit Marcellus like physical blows, and he felt his certainty about this case beginning to crack. If Mallory had been a foreign intelligence asset, if his activities had been discovered and he'd been eliminated as part of a counterintelligence operation, then everything Marcellus thought he knew about this case was wrong. But something didn't add up. If Mallory was a spy, why wasn't his elimination handled through proper channels? Why store his body in an abandoned facility and let it be discovered years later? That's not how counterintelligence operations work. Ashford lowered his hands slowly, careful to keep them visible and non-threatening. Because the operation he was part of is bigger than one dead spy. Mallory was connected to a network of compromised individuals within law enforcement and government institutions. We couldn't formally prosecute him without exposing the larger investigation and alerting everyone else in the network. So, we eliminated him quietly and stored the evidence in case we needed it later. This facility has been used for years as a repository for materials related to that investigation. Things that can't be processed through normal bureau channels because we don't know who we can trust. Ivy had moved up to join Marcellus, her weapon also trained on Ashford and his two companions. She was bleeding from a cut on her forehead, probably sustained when the lights went out and she'd moved in darkness. But her hands were steady, and her voice was sharp with anger. You're describing an extrajudicial operation that violates every law and regulation the Bureau is supposed to uphold. Even if Mallory was a foreign intelligence asset, you don't get to murder him and hide the evidence. There are processes, oversight, legal frameworks that exist for exactly these situations. One of the other agents, a woman Marcellus didn't recognize, spoke up. Those processes are compromised. The oversight committees have members who are themselves foreign assets, or who've been blackmailed into cooperation. The legal frameworks you're talking about are designed to protect the guilty and expose the innocent. We tried working within the system for years, and all it did was allow the problem to get worse. So, we started operating outside the system, using methods that actually work even if they're not officially sanctioned. Marcellus felt like he was trapped in a nightmare that kept getting worse. He'd walked into what he thought was a straightforward murder investigation, and had instead stumbled into the same shadow war that apparently had consumed multiple other FBI investigations. The surveillance operation that had targeted agents asking questions about closed cases. The kidnapping and torture of agents who got too close to classified information. And now this, a group of federal agents conducting extrajudicial killings and storing bodies in an abandoned cold storage facility, all justified by claims of national security and compromised institutions. Even if everything you're saying is true, Marcellus said carefully, trying to find some solid ground in this morass of conflicting claims, you understand that what you're describing is illegal and unconstitutional. You're asking me to accept that the Bureau has been infiltrated so thoroughly that legitimate law enforcement has become impossible, and that your response to that infiltration is to become criminals yourselves. How is that different from the people you claim to be fighting?" Ashford's expression hardened. "It's different because we're trying to protect this country from enemies who don't care about your constitutional principles. They use those principles against us, hiding behind legal protections while they undermine everything those laws are supposed to defend. We didn't choose this path, Crane. It was forced on us by an enemy that's been winning for decades, while people like you insisted on playing by rules that only apply to our side." He gestured toward the storage unit where Vincent Mallory's body had been found. "You want to know why we kept him frozen? Because he's not the only one in there." The statement hung in the air like a physical presence. Marcellus and Ivy exchanged glances, and he could see his own horror reflected in her expression. "What do you mean he's not the only one?" Ivy asked, though Marcellus suspected she'd already guessed the answer. Ashford gestured for them to follow, and after a moment's hesitation Marcellus did, keeping his weapon ready but lowering it slightly. They moved through the facility to a section they hadn't yet examined, where several large storage units were running at maximum cold. Ashford opened one of the unit doors, and the scene inside was like something from a macabre museum. Bodies were stacked on metal shelving, each one carefully preserved by the sub-zero temperatures. Each one positioned with the same ritualistic care that had been applied to Vincent Mallory. Marcellus counted quickly and came up with at least 15 visible bodies, with more potentially hidden deeper in the unit. "Who are they?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Foreign intelligence assets," Ashford said flatly. "People who infiltrated law enforcement, government agencies, military units. People who were passing classified information to hostile governments, recruiting other traitors, sabotaging operations meant to protect American citizens. Every one of them was identified through counterintelligence work, confirmed through multiple independent sources, and eliminated when it became clear that formal prosecution would compromise ongoing investigations. Their bodies are kept here as evidence, documentation that the threat is real, and that we're taking action against it." Marcellus felt his stomach turning, the implications of what he was seeing overwhelming his ability to process. If these bodies were really foreign intelligence assets, if they'd really been eliminated as part of a sanctioned counterintelligence operation, then he was looking at evidence of a shadow war being fought within American institutions, a war that the public knew nothing about. But if Ashford and his colleagues were lying, if these were innocent people murdered by rogue agents who'd convinced themselves they were patriots, then he was looking at one of the most horrific serial-killing operations in American history. "You understand that I can't just accept your word for this," Marcellus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're asking me to believe that the FBI has been compromised to the point where extrajudicial killings are necessary, and that these bodies represent legitimate national security operations rather than criminal murders. But I have no independent verification of any of that. All I have is your claims and a room full of dead people." He turned to face Ashford directly. "I need to report this to Supervisory Special Agent Price and let him make the determination about how to proceed." Ashford's expression shifted, becoming unreadable. "Declan Price knows about this facility. He's known for years. Why do you think he assigned you to investigate Mallory's murder? He knew you'd find this place, knew you'd discover what we've been doing, and he wanted to see how you'd react. This is a test, Crane. Price is trying to determine whether you're someone who can accept the reality of the situation we're facing, or whether you're going to be another idealist who insists on proper procedures even when those procedures have been designed to protect our enemies." The revelation hit Marcellus like a physical blow. Price had known. The supervisor who'd created the compartmented investigation, who'd expressed concern about bureau connections to the facility, who'd positioned this assignment as a sensitive case requiring careful handling. He'd known about the bodies, known about the extrajudicial killings, and had sent Marcellus and Ivy to discover them. The question was why. Was Price part of this shadow organization, testing potential recruits? Or was he investigating the organization and using Marcellus to gather evidence without exposing himself? Ivy spoke up, her voice carrying the cold, analytical tone she used when processing complex evidence. This entire scenario has been orchestrated. The anonymous tip that led Chicago PD to discover Mallory's body. The timing of our assignment to investigate. The fact that you were positioned here to intercept us. None of this is coincidence. Someone is running an operation, and we're pieces being moved on a board we don't understand. She looked at Marcellus. We need to extract from this facility immediately and report directly to higher authority than Price. Whatever's happening here, we can't trust that the normal chain of command is clean. Ashford made a gesture, and the other two agents with him shifted their positions slightly. Not quite threatening, but clearly repositioning to block the exit routes. You're not leaving with information about this facility. That's not negotiable. Either you accept that we're on the same side and agree to maintain operational security, or we have a different conversation about how to handle security breaches. The implicit threat was clear, and Marcellus felt his grip tightening on his weapon. You're threatening federal agents, Marcellus said, his voice hard. That's a line you can't uncross, Ashford. If you're really operating with legitimate authority, then let us report what we've found through proper channels and let the system determine how to proceed. If you're not willing to do that, then you're admitting that this operation doesn't have legitimate sanction and that you're acting as criminals using national security as cover. He could see the tension in Ashford's body language, the micro-expressions that suggested internal conflict. The man believed what he was doing was necessary, but he also understood the implications of using force against fellow agents. Before the situation could deteriorate further, Marcellus's phone suddenly began receiving notifications. The jamming apparently lifted. Multiple missed calls from Declan Price, text messages marked urgent, and an automated alert about a security breach at the Federal Plaza building. Something had happened while they'd been trapped in this facility, something significant enough to trigger emergency protocols. Marcellus pulled up the most recent message from Price, and what he read made everything else in this investigation suddenly seem less important. The message was brief and professionally worded, but the content was explosive. Facility compromised, multiple agents detained, OPR executing warrants for suspected counterintelligence violations. Return to Federal Plaza immediately. Speak to no one until debriefed by authorized personnel. Marcellus showed the message to Ivy, then to Ashford, watching the other agent's expression shift from confidence to concern to something approaching fear. They're moving against the network, Ashford said quietly, and Marcellus wasn't sure if he was talking to them or to himself. The Office of Professional Responsibility has been investigating for months, building cases against everyone involved in unauthorized operations. We knew it was coming eventually, but we thought we had more time. He looked at Marcellus with an expression that might have been regret. You should go. Report what you found here. Tell them about the bodies, about our operation, about everything. It doesn't matter anymore. The whole structure is coming down, and nothing we do here is going to change that. Marcellus and Ivy moved cautiously toward the exit, weapons still ready, not trusting that Ashford's apparent resignation was genuine. But the other agents made no move to stop them, just stood in that room full of frozen bodies looking like soldiers who just realized they were fighting for a losing cause. The walk back through the North Point facility felt surreal, the harsh fluorescent lighting revealing details they'd missed in darkness, the mechanical hum of refrigeration equipment now sounding like a requiem for something that had existed in shadows and was now being dragged into light. They reached the facility's main entrance where the Chicago PD patrol car was still stationed. But the officer who'd been on duty was now joined by multiple bureau vehicles and at least a dozen agents wearing OPR identification. A woman in a dark suit stepped forward as Marcellus and Ivy emerged from the building, her credentials identifying her as Deputy Assistant Director Patricia Guthrie, Office of Professional Responsibility. Agents Crane and Langston, you'll need to come with us for immediate debriefing. We have a lot of questions about what you found inside that facility, and we need your statements while the details are still fresh. The next 12 hours were a blur of interviews, evidence documentation, and formal statements given to OPR investigators who seemed to already know most of what Marcellus told them. Apparently, the investigation into extrajudicial operations within the Bureau had been running for over a year, building cases against dozens of agents across multiple field offices. The discovery of Vincent Mallory's body had been the catalyst that allowed OPR to move publicly, giving them a concrete crime scene that couldn't be explained away or classified under national security protocols. Everything that followed, Marcellus's assignment to investigate, the confrontation at the facility, even the timing of when Price had sent them in, all of it had been choreographed to force the shadow organization into exposing themselves. Declan Price, as it turned out, had been working with OPR for 6 months, feeding them information about suspected unauthorized operations, while maintaining his cover as a loyal supervisor. The compartmented investigations, the careful management of which agents worked, which cases, all of it had been designed to identify everyone involved in the shadow network and gather evidence sufficient for prosecution. Marcellus and Ivy had been unknowing participants in that larger operation, their investigation serving as both legitimate law enforcement work and as bait to draw out the people running illegal operations. By the time Marcellus was finally allowed to leave the Federal Plaza building, it was approaching midnight, and he felt like he'd aged a decade in a single day. The arrests were still ongoing, with agents being detained at multiple locations throughout Chicago and in field offices across the country. The media was reporting a major FBI internal investigation, but didn't have details yet, though Marcellus suspected that would change quickly as the scale of what had been uncovered became public. The story would be explosive. Federal agents conducting extrajudicial killings, bodies stored in an abandoned facility, claims of foreign intelligence infiltration used to justify illegal operations. The question that haunted Marcellus as he drove home through Chicago's empty streets was whether the justifications offered by Ashford and his colleagues had any validity. Were American institutions really so compromised by foreign intelligence that extra-legal actions had become necessary? Or was that just a rationalization used by people who decided that the ends justified any means? The OPR investigation would eventually provide some answers, but Marcellus suspected that complete truth would remain elusive. In operations involving intelligence and counterintelligence, truth was always layered and conditional, shaped by perspective and limited by classification. What he knew for certain was that Vincent Mallory was dead, along with at least 15 other people whose bodies had been found in that cold storage facility. Whether those deaths were murders or sanctioned eliminations, whether the people responsible were criminals or patriots, would ultimately be determined by courts and investigators with access to classified information that Marcellus would never see. His role in the investigation was complete. He'd found the evidence, documented the crime scene, and provided testimony that would be used in whatever prosecutions eventually moved forward. 3 weeks later, Marcellus received a letter from the FBI Director's Office, commending him for his work on a sensitive investigation that had exposed serious misconduct within the Bureau. The letter was professionally written and carefully worded, praising his dedication to proper procedures and his commitment to upholding the law even in difficult circumstances. It said nothing about the bodies in the cold storage facility, nothing about the shadow organization that had been operating within the Bureau for years, nothing about whether the claims of foreign intelligence infiltration had been validated or debunked. The investigation was ongoing, and details remained classified. Marcellus filed the letter away and returned to his regular caseload, working the cold cases that formed his specialty, trying to find justice for victims whose deaths had gone unsolved for years or decades. But he found himself looking at those cases differently now, wondering what details might be deliberately obscured, which investigations might have been shut down to protect operations he wasn't cleared to know about, whether the Bureau he'd devoted his career to was really the institution he'd believed it to be. He never spoke to Trevor Ashford again. The agent was arrested the night of the North Point facility confrontation and was held pending trial on charges that Marcellus wasn't authorized to know the details of. Rumor through the field office suggested that Ashford and several other agents had accepted plea agreements, providing testimony about the shadow organization's operations in exchange for reduced sentences. But rumors were all anyone had, because the entire investigation was classified at levels that kept most agents in the dark about what had really been discovered and what it meant for the Bureau's future. Ivy Langston returned to Quantico after providing her statements to OPR, and she and Marcellus maintained occasional contact through professional channels. She never directly discussed what they'd found in the cold storage facility, but her messages carried an undercurrent of disillusionment that Marcellus recognized because he felt it too. They'd entered that investigation as true believers in the system, confident that proper procedures and dedication to the law would lead to justice. They'd emerged with a more complicated understanding of how institutions actually worked, of the shadows that existed within even organizations dedicated to upholding the law. The North Point cold storage facility was sealed and placed under federal guard while the investigation continued. Eventually, it would be demolished, the bodies recovered and identified, the evidence processed through proper channels. But that process would take years, and by the time it was complete, public attention would have moved on to other scandals and other crises. The story would be footnoted in history as an example of institutional corruption identified and addressed, a demonstration that internal oversight systems worked even when confronted with serious misconduct. Marcellus knew that official narrative was both true and incomplete. Yes, the oversight systems had eventually worked, but they'd taken years to identify the problem, had allowed unauthorized operations to continue far longer than should have been possible, and had only succeeded in exposing the shadow organization because of lucky breaks like the anonymous tip that led to discovering Vincent Mallory's body. How many other operations like this were still running, unknown to oversight, protected by classification and need-to-know restrictions that kept even well-meaning investigators in the dark? On quiet nights, when sleep wouldn't come, Marcellus found himself back in that cold storage facility in his mind, standing in darkness while hostile actors maneuvered around him, not knowing who to trust or what the truth really was. He'd made it out alive and intact, had done his job and served justice as best he understood it. But the experience had marked him, had introduced doubt where certainty used to exist, had shown him that the institutions he'd believed in were more fragile and more compromised than he'd ever imagined. Vincent Mallory was still dead. The bodies in the freezer were still dead. And somewhere in the shadowy space between legal authority and extrajudicial action, between national security and constitutional law, the struggle continued over what methods were acceptable in defending the country from its enemies. Marcellus had chosen to stand on the side of law and proper procedures, had rejected the justifications offered by agents who believed the ends justified any means. But late at night, when he remembered the conviction in Trevor Ashford's voice when he talked about compromised institutions and necessary measures, Marcellus wondered if he'd been right to make that choice. or if he'd just been too idealistic to accept the harsh realities of a war being fought in shadows. The cold storage facility was eventually demolished in the spring of 2025, reduced to rubble and hauled away, the contaminated ground beneath it remediated and prepared for redevelopment. The physical structure was gone, but what it represented remained. A reminder that even institutions dedicated to justice could harbor darkness, that good intentions could be corrupted by fear and certainty, and that the line between protecting the country and betraying its principles was thinner and more easily crossed than anyone wanted to admit. Marcellus Crane continued his work with the FBI, investigating cold cases and seeking justice for forgotten victims, carrying with him the knowledge that some truths were too dangerous to fully expose, and some questions would never have satisfactory answers. He'd found Vincent Mallory's killer, had exposed a shadow organization operating within the Bureau, had done everything his oath required of him. But he'd also learned that victory could feel hollow, that solving a case didn't always bring clarity or closure, and that sometimes the most disturbing aspect of an investigation was discovering that the real world was far more complicated and morally ambiguous than the clear categories of law and criminality suggested. The case was closed, officially, if not emotionally. The investigation continued in classified channels beyond his access. And somewhere in Chicago, in abandoned buildings and secured facilities, other secrets waited to be discovered by agents who would have to make the same choices Marcellus had made, navigating between duty and doubt, between procedure and pragmatism, between the law they'd sworn to uphold and the shadows that existed within the institutions meant to enforce it. The cold storage of forgotten crimes and hidden operations, preserved against the day when someone would finally bring them into the light. And the cost of that exposure would be measured in careers destroyed, lives disrupted, and certainties shattered beyond repair.